It happened suddenly. The protagonist was reincarnated into another world. The newborn baby cried. However, the king ordered that an announcement be made declaring that his son, Prince Lionheart, was dead. Inside the body of the newborn, the protagonist reacted in confusion. The thought passed through his mind as he tried to grasp the situation. Was he about to be killed right after being reincarnated? For events like this to unfold, his mind drifted back to modern Japan. He remembered sitting in front of his screen, thinking about his past. During his third year of middle school, he had been bullied so severely that he eventually became a shut-in. 5 years passed after that. During that time, he lived a vague and directionless life, with no hope for the future. At some point during that dull existence, a light suddenly illuminated the room. From that light, a girl appeared and congratulated him. She explained that after a careful screening process, it had been decided that he would be reincarnated into a different world. The protagonist struggled to understand the meaning of those words. A different world sounded strange and unreal. The woman then read from something in her hand and continued explaining. Since magic existed in that world, she would grant him a cheat skill in order to make his life there easier. She encouraged him to enjoy his second life to the fullest. Looking back on it now, the protagonist realized that he must have died in that room. Still, there was only one thing he truly wanted. He wanted to live a peaceful life. A life where he could spend each day completely absorbed in games and anime, so immersed that he would not even notice the sun setting outside. That kind of lifestyle seemed perfect to him. Because of that, he had made up his mind. He would accept this reincarnation. Whatever this cheat skill was, he would use it to live the best and laziest life possible in this new world. When he opened his eyes, the protagonist saw something surprising. In front of him were his own tiny hands. It seemed that he had started this new life as a baby. Nearby, a woman's voice announced that it was a healthy boy. She addressed the king respectfully while presenting the newborn. The king then turned to his queen and remarked that the baby resembled both of them. In his eyes, the child was a beautiful prince. The royal crest was clearly visible on the baby's chest, leaving no doubt that the child truly belonged to the royal family. The queen, Jisrat, responded firmly, making it clear that there was no possibility of her betraying the king. As the protagonist listened, he realized something important. That beautiful woman and the handsome king were his parents. Being reincarnated as royalty already felt remarkable. With luck, if he happened to be something like their 8th child, then perhaps no one would pay too much attention to him. That would allow him to quietly live the shut-in life he wanted. The king soon gave another order. The baby's magic power was to be measured immediately. The mage brought out a magic ball. In his mind, the protagonist already understood what this meant. In this world, a person's magic power was measured the moment they were born. The king immediately demanded the result. He wanted to know the level of the prince's magic power. Perhaps it was over 40. Maybe even far beyond 50. After all, the child had been born to the lightning princess who once defeated the demon lord, and to the king himself. The king felt certain that the baby possessed remarkable magic power. The mage hesitated and began to stutter while giving the result. The baby's magic power was level 2. The king reacted with confusion, unsure if he had heard correctly. The mage repeated the result. The prince's magic level was 2. On top of that, the baby had no magical attribute, and the only magic he could use was barrier magic. The king wondered if there had been some kind of mistake. The mage, looking nervous, shook his head. Both the king and the queen were stunned. Inside his small body, the protagonist began to feel uneasy. A bad feeling started to form in his mind. The king could not accept what he had heard. If word spread that his son was so useless, he would become the laughingstock of his subjects. The queen agreed with the seriousness of the situation. To her, it seemed like the beginning of a long and dark history. The question of what they should do weighed heavily on both of them. Anger quickly replaced their shock. The king came to a sudden decision. They would simply announce that Prince Lionheart had been born dead. The protagonist was stunned by what he heard. In his mind, disbelief rushed through him. He could not understand what these parents were thinking. The thought crossed his mind that they might actually be foolish. The possibility of dying right after being reincarnated became terrifyingly real. He wondered if he had ended up with the same kind of terrible parents he had known in his previous world. The promised cheat ability seemed meaningless now. The situation made no sense to him. The king then gave a clear order. Someone was to take the baby and abandon him in a distant forest. The decision had been made. Far away, the goddess suddenly cried out in alarm, realizing that something had gone terribly wrong. Her attendant quickly asked what had happened. The goddess explained the problem. The child she had just reincarnated had indeed been given a cheat ability, but the way it appeared had been completely misunderstood. The goddess's attendant asked what she meant. The goddess explained that the measuring device only went up to 2 digits. Because of that limit, the result had been displayed incorrectly. She also realized that she had forgotten to assign the baby an attribute. The attendant then asked what magic power the goddess had originally set for him. The goddess revealed the number. The value shown as 02 was actually meant to be 1002. A moment of silence followed. The attendant concluded that the goddess had gone far beyond what was reasonable. Later, deep within a forest, the baby was left behind. The knights who carried out the order spoke quietly among themselves. One of them remarked that he did not know the full circumstances, but the baby was clearly a very unfortunate child. The other knight responded that they should leave the area quickly before any monsters appeared. The first agreed, and the two of them departed from the forest. Left alone, the baby struggled to process the situation. In his mind, disbelief filled his thoughts. The seriousness of the problem was obvious. Yet there was little he could do in his current state. His body was too small to move properly. Then he remembered something important. The woman who spoke to him before had said that he could use barrier magic. Deciding to try it, he focused and formed an image in his mind. The baby's eyes widened. The magic worked. A cube-like barrier appeared around him. It became clear that using magic was not as difficult as he had expected. He experimented with the barrier, making the cube grow smaller and larger. He even changed its color. The cube shifted into different shapes as he adjusted it. As he continued experimenting, the protagonist felt that the barrier could be shaped into almost anything he imagined. Soon another idea formed. Perhaps it could be used in a practical way. With that thought, the barrier lifted him into the air. He found himself floating. The magic proved far more useful than he had originally imagined. At the same time, he noticed something unusual. Despite using magic repeatedly, he did not feel any sense of his power running out. Now another thought appeared. If a monster were to show up, he would need some kind of way to attack. Not far away, a wolf had already noticed the baby. The wolf stared at the strange sight of a floating infant. The protagonist reacted with shock. The sudden appearance caught him completely off guard. The wolf opened its mouth and lunged forward, attempting to bite him. The protagonist quickly focused his magic and formed a protective barrier. The wolf's teeth struck the barrier but could not break through. Realizing this, the protagonist understood that the barrier was much stronger than it appeared. He then created many small cubes. Using those cubes, he launched an attack against the wolf. The cubes struck the animal, causing it to recoil and roar. However, the protagonist noticed that the attack did not cause much damage. The wolf was still standing. He began searching for something larger that could be used as a weapon. His attention shifted toward the surrounding trees. Using the cubes, he pulled several trees out of the ground and hurled them toward the wolf. The trees crashed down onto the animal, knocking it to the ground. Watching carefully, the protagonist wondered if the attack had been enough. He floated above the wolf, observing the result. Suddenly, the wolf began to move again. The sight surprised him. Even that heavy attack had not finished it. A sense of nervousness rose inside him. Then another idea formed in his mind. He prepared to try something different. As the baby gathered his magic for another attack, the wolf reacted with alarm. Instead of attacking again, the wolf urgently tried to stop him and surrendered. The protagonist was caught off guard. The word surrender reached his ears, leaving him confused about where it had come from. Ignoring it at first, he continued his action and lifted a large piece of land with his barrier cubes, preparing to attack again. The wolf repeated its surrender. The protagonist paused and looked directly at the wolf. Only then did he realize that the voice had come from the animal itself. The realization settled in his mind that the one speaking was the wolf. The wolf watched the floating baby carefully. It explained that it had originally planned to eat the baby in order to replenish its magic power. However, the baby had turned out to be far stronger than expected. The wolf could not understand who or what the baby truly was. The baby attempted to respond, but quickly realized something frustrating. His mouth could not form proper words. The wolf observed the baby closely and noticed the problem. Even though the baby appeared mature enough to think and act rationally, he could not speak. The protagonist immediately recognized how inconvenient that limitation was. Being unable to speak would cause too many problems. Then an idea came to him. Since he could manipulate barrier magic freely, perhaps he could create a barrier that emitted sound. If such a barrier were placed near his throat and controlled with his thoughts, it might allow him to produce speech. He focused his magic and attempted the idea. A sound came out. The attempt worked. Using the sound-emitting barrier, the protagonist managed to greet the wolf. The wolf reacted with visible discomfort at the sight of a baby speaking in such a strange way. The baby responded with mild annoyance at the reaction. The wolf quickly apologized, explaining that the voice simply sounded unnatural coming from an infant. The baby then introduced himself as Haruto. He explained that he had been born in a nearby country but had been abandoned because his magic power was considered too low. The wolf questioned that explanation. From the wolf's perspective, the magic flowing from Haruto was overwhelming. The amount far exceeded what any normal human could possess. A realization slowly formed in the wolf's mind. It began to suspect that Haruto might actually be the reincarnation of the demon lord. Haruto reacted with surprise at the idea. In his previous life he had only been a shut-in. However, he decided it would be better not to correct the misunderstanding. Allowing the wolf to believe that story seemed easier. With that thought, Haruto accepted the label and claimed to be the demon lord. The wolf immediately concluded that the explanation made sense. Haruto was undeniably powerful. The wolf accepted his defeat and prepared himself for the end. In his mind, the only proper outcome was for Haruto to finish him. Haruto, however, had no intention of killing the wolf. Instead, he simply asked for one thing. The wolf only needed to promise that he would never attack again. The wolf was deeply moved by this response. To him, such mercy was exactly what one would expect from the demon lord. He then swore upon his own name that he would keep his word. As Frema of the Fenrir clan, he would never break that promise. Haruto took interest in the name. The mention of the Fenrir clan suggested that Frema was a warrior. Realizing this, Haruto felt satisfied with the outcome. With the matter settled, Haruto prepared to continue on his way. Frema's eyes widened at the sight of Haruto leaving so easily. He could hardly believe what had just happened. What began as a reckless choice had somehow turned into the most fortunate event of his life. Frema quickly called out for Haruto to wait. Haruto noticed the way Frema addressed him. The title carried respect that he had not expected. Frema explained that Haruto had not only spared his life but had also given him a new name. Because of that, a contract between them had now been formed. With that bond established, Frema offered himself completely. He declared his loyalty and devoted his entire existence to Haruto as his master. In that moment, Haruto had unknowingly gained a powerful servant. Deep within the forest, Haruto had somehow turned a massive wolf into his follower. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. One click equals instant power-up. Subscribe now. Back to the story. Haruto wondered how the situation had somehow turned into a discussion about forming a contract. He tried explaining to the wolf that the name Fry he had just mentioned was only a shortened form of Frema's full name. The wolf reacted with a blush, thinking that Fry had a pleasant sound to it. In Haruto's mind, it became clear that Fry had not really been listening to what he was saying. He attempted once more to explain that he had never intended to create any kind of contract. However, his head slowly drooped downward. Fry noticed the change and grew concerned, wondering if something was wrong. Haruto had discovered a problem that magic could not solve. Faced with it, he ended up asking for boobies. As a result, Haruto somehow gained a servant, though his HP had now fallen to 0. The situation left him wondering what he was supposed to do next. Fry remained at an unknown level, while Haruto himself was only level 2. Several choices appeared before him. The first option was something he did not need. The second option involved boobs. The third option suggested fleeing. Thinking about it further, he realized he had not eaten anything since the moment he was born. He tried asking for help with that, though he expected it to be impossible. Fry then realized what he meant and understood that he was asking for breast milk. If it was only that much, Fry believed she could manage it. Haruto reacted with surprise at the possibility. Fry maintained that for her master she would do anything necessary to fulfill her resolve. At that moment, a glow suddenly surrounded her. Frey's wolf form began to shrink, and her body transformed until it took the shape of a human girl. Fry had successfully turned into a human. She stood there without questioning whether anything was wrong. Haruto quickly covered his face and urged her to put on some clothes. Only then did Fry realize that she was completely naked. She apologized for her rudeness and explained that returning to her previous form would take some time. She felt deeply sorry for having dirted his eyes. Haruto insisted that was not the issue. With an awkward reaction, he produced a black cube, which immediately transformed into clothing. Fry put it on, but the result made Haruto exclaim that the appearance had somehow become even more erotic. Fry then checked whether it was acceptable to begin breastfeeding. Haruto accepted the idea. As she prepared to do so, Fry began unzipping the clothing she had just put on, and before long she was naked once again. Haruto complained internally about why she had to remove everything. Fry looked puzzled at the concern. In her understanding, breast milk would only come from the mother's body after the act of reproduction had taken place. Following that reasoning, she asked Haruto for his seeds. At that moment Haruto came to a realization. The girl standing before him was naturally Airhead. Some time later, Fry appeared apologetic. She felt regret for her earlier rudeness and seemed to expect that her careless remarks might have sounded strange. Haruto accepted that the situation could not really be helped and felt there was no reason for her to become depressed about it. Suddenly Fry reacted to a sound nearby. Haruto noticed the change and focused on her. Fry sensed that someone was approaching. She wondered whether she should eliminate the person. Haruto rejected that idea and decided they needed to talk first. For the moment he wanted to understand the person's objective. A small cube moved toward Fry and slipped into her ear. Through it, Haruto explained that she would now be able to hear his voice. Not far away, a man climbed down from his horse. The man and Fry stood facing each other while he observed the scene before him. Fry questioned the reason for the man's presence there. The man explained that he had come to take the baby. Fry refused. The man was confused by the rejection and questioned why he should be refused by her. Fry responded with a calm smile, explaining that Haruto had only recently become her lord. Because of that, he now belonged to her. Inside Haruto's mind, the thought immediately surfaced that he had never planned to belong to her at all. The man continued, explaining that the baby was the child of one of his relatives. The family had thrown the child away, but he had come to save him. Fry focused on that claim. Someone had come to save the baby, yet they were trying to retrieve something that had already been discarded once. The logic did not make sense to her, and she found herself unable to understand humans at all. The man insisted that humans possessed feelings. He also reasoned that the baby must be hungry by now. With that in mind, he handed over a pouch so that it could be given to the child. The thought of food immediately crossed Haruto's mind. He urged Fry to take it. However, Fry became angry. She interpreted the man's action as a strategy, assuming he knew she could not produce breast milk. In her eyes, that made him a coward. At that point she stopped listening to Haruto. Haruto tried to call out to her, thinking about how he was starving. Fry, however, continued insisting that if the baby wanted breast milk, she could provide it herself. She declared that she would prove she was capable of producing it. Haruto could only think in disbelief. The thought formed clearly in his mind, questioning whether she was actually foolish. The man then pointed out that even setting aside the matter of breast milk, he did not believe she would be able to properly raise a human baby. Fry believed that the result could only be known after trying. Haruto urged Fry in his mind to quiet down already. The food was right in front of his eyes, yet he still could not eat it. The thought crossed his mind about whether he was going to die like this. Fry once again directed her attention to the man, questioning why he was so determined about this baby. The man paused briefly before answering. He explained that the matter came from a personal story. In the past, his wife had carried a child. However, that child had never been born. Fry reacted with surprise. The man continued his explanation. The baby being discussed had been thrown away because it was considered to have no value. To him, however, such a judgment did not matter. Regardless of what kind of child it was, he still wished to praise the child simply for being born. That alone was his reason. Fry began to cry as she thought about it. The story felt sad to her. She imagined a mother who could not even hold her beloved child in her arms, and the thought of that sadness weighed heavily. The man observed Frey's reaction. The sight of a demon who had suddenly chosen a human child as her lord and then started crying appeared strange to him. From there, he proposed a deal. If Fry truly wanted the child to remain her lord, she would have to work as his personal attendant. That was the condition he presented. Fry accepted that after reaching this point, it could not be helped. She decided that she would remain nearby and watch over things from the side as well. The man acknowledged the agreement and considered the deal sealed. He then pulled out a hammer-like weapon and struck the baby's basket, smashing it apart. After that, he instructed Fry to tear the baby's cloth and replace it with another one he provided. Fry observed the situation and recognized it as a form of staged work. Next, the man cut his own arm and allowed his blood to drip onto the baby's basket. After finishing that, he indicated that it was time to leave. Fry lifted the baby into her arms. Haruto then asked Fry if she could still provide the breast milk mentioned earlier. Fry responded that if he wanted breast milk, she could provide it herself. Haruto reacted with disbelief at the idea. His thoughts immediately returned to the food he had seen earlier. After that, they all left the place together. 9 years later, the sound of footsteps echoed through a hallway. The person who arrived at the breakfast table greeted both mother and father with the morning greeting. The man sitting there while reading a newspaper returned the greeting to Haruto. By that time, Haruto was living under the protection of Margrave Gordo and had managed to survive. Fry had also taken on a new role, having transformed into a maid. 9 years had passed since the time Haruto had been thrown away. He had been taken in by Margrave Gordo, who had now become his father. In truth, Haruto had originally planned to leave this house once he had grown past infancy. However, the kindness and comfort from the people around him gradually made him stay longer than he had intended, almost without realizing it. If there was one problem he could point to, it was his little sister, Charlotte. From as far back as he could remember, she had always been strangely afraid of him. Being disliked by a little girl brought a quiet sadness to him as an older brother. Later that day, Fry arrived carrying all the food. As usual, she looked irritated, wondering why none of them were doing anything to make Haruto happier. Although Fry had been living in the house as a maid, her usual arrogance had not changed. She placed the food down and directed Charlotte to eat everything. Charlotte greeted Fry with excitement. She had grown very attached to her. Charlotte asked if they would play together again that day. Fry refused at first, explaining that she had the responsibility of taking care of Haruto's needs. Haruto then told Fry to go ahead and play with Charlotte instead. Hearing that, Fry accepted the idea, and Charlotte immediately became very happy. Soon the two of them ran around together, with Charlotte chasing after Fry during their game. Haruto watched them quietly from the window. Someone then called out to him. It was his mother. Haruto responded that the situation did not bother him at all. His mother, however, felt that it did not seem that way. She smiled gently and shared her thoughts. In her view, Charlotte might be avoiding Haruto simply because she did not know how to deal with someone of the opposite sex who was close to her own age. After all, Charlotte was very attached to Fry, who was also a girl. Hearing that explanation, a thought crossed Haruto's mind. Frey's true identity as a demon apparently did not seem to be a problem. Another thought followed immediately after. The possibility suddenly appeared in his mind that Charlotte might somehow have seen through his inner self the 30-year-old uncle he once was. In his imagination, he pictured Charlotte reacting to him with disgust, claiming that he smelled like a shut-in uncle and telling him not to come near her. Within his thoughts, the idea felt strangely possible. After all, little girls usually did not like uncles. His mother then encouraged him not to feel so discouraged about it. She suggested that he try giving Charlotte something. Perhaps if Haruto showed her a gesture like a proper older brother would, Charlotte's opinion of him might change. Haruto thought to himself that for someone as unsociable as he was, overcoming a challenge of that level would be impossible. His mother then reminded him that he was the heir to this magnificent castle. Instead of remaining in his room all the time, she believed it would be better for him to go outside and spend time playing with Charlotte. She also promised that she would support the two of them with all her strength so that they could eventually get along well. Haruto expressed his gratitude toward her. Later, inside his room, Haruto lay quietly on his bed. While resting there, he spoke to a robot that had been made to resemble him. He wondered what the robot thought about the situation. For the past 9 years, Haruto had been researching barrier magic in order to prepare for the day he would eventually leave this place. As part of that preparation, he had attempted to create a copy robot. However, the current version was still unable to speak, which meant he could not move it yet. Then another thought occurred to him. The reason he created the robot was so he could leave without making anyone sad. If that was the case, then he would also need to create a doll of Fry. The idea made him pause. If that were necessary, then how many years would it take before he could finally leave and live quietly as a shut-in? Haruto felt uncertain about what he should do next. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Gordo called out for Haruto to come with him for a moment. At that moment, Haruto developed a bad feeling about the situation. They were standing outside the castle. Gordo explained that he had been thinking about beginning Haruto's training in sword arts from that point forward. Haruto reacted with a grim expression. Gordo noticed immediately that Haruto was not even attempting to hide the disgust on his face. In Haruto's mind, sword arts seemed like something completely unsuitable for someone like him, a person who preferred the life of a shut-in. Gordo then pointed out that Haruto's magic level was extremely low. Because of that, it was necessary for him to develop his other abilities instead. Gordo then considered another possibility and wondered if Haruto perhaps had something else he wanted to pursue. Haruto nearly answered that he simply wanted to remain a shut-in. However, he stopped himself, coughed lightly, and instead mentioned that he wanted to research barrier magic. Gordo's eyes widened at that response. The idea of exploring the potential of lost magic caught his interest. Gordo then apologized, explaining that he had previously misunderstood what Haruto had been doing every day while staying shut inside his room. Inside Haruto's mind, the thought appeared that he had successfully deceived Gordo. Haruto then attempted to leave the situation, but Gordo stopped him. Gordo explained that it was not as if Haruto had absolutely no talent when it came to sword arts. The only way to know for sure would be to try. Gordo instructed Haruto to charge at him. Haruto caught the wooden sword that Gordo tossed toward him. As Haruto had expected, refusing the request did not seem possible. Gordo told him that he could attack at any time. In Haruto's thoughts, his father was known by the alias Earth-Ringing Warhammer. Because of that reputation, landing even a single hit on him felt completely impossible. For the moment, Haruto decided that he would cover his weak physical strength with a barrier. This barrier could not be seen by others, which meant he would not be able to use it secretly. Unnoticed by them, Charlotte was watching the scene from behind. Haruto settled his thoughts. The plan was to end the situation quickly. He suddenly dashed forward toward Gordo and launched an attack. Gordo moved aside to dodge the strike, but at that moment the wooden sword broke apart. Haruto immediately realized the mistake. He had forgotten to place a barrier on the sword itself. Gordo reacted with confusion, stumbling over his words as he questioned what Haruto had just done. Haruto himself was equally confused. Haruto wondered if Gordo had become angry because the wooden sword had broken. Gordo mentioned that he would hold himself back later, but for now it would be better to avoid doing so. Immediately after that, Gordo charged forward quickly. Haruto managed to dodge the attack. Seeing the incoming strike, Haruto jumped away from Gordo and landed behind his father. Gordo's eyes widened at the sight. In Haruto's mind, the moment felt dangerous. At the same time, he remembered that his father had just said he would restrain himself earlier. Both of them appeared confused. Haruto wondered why his father had suddenly stopped moving. Meanwhile, Gordo questioned the situation in his own mind. His attack should not have missed. Normally, an attack like that could not be avoided unless the opponent was at least level 30 or higher. Haruto himself also felt that something about the situation was strange. At one point, he had assumed that perhaps his magic level might be somewhere in the 3-digit range. To confirm that, he had created his own crystal through the use of barrier magic. However, that expectation had been completely overturned. In human history, the highest recorded magic capacity had been 77. Because of that, someone having a capacity in the 4-digit range simply did not exist. That meant his magic level was only 2, and it had been confirmed that he possessed no attribute at all. Because of that result, Haruto had come to the conclusion that he could still use magic efficiently even without any attribute. The most likely explanation was that the goddess had granted him something like a cheat ability. Gordo murmured to himself that Haruto seemed completely unaware of it, and that realization led his thoughts somewhere further. Haruto called out to his father, pulling him back to the moment. Gordo brushed aside the confusion and stated that Haruto's movements were still rough and unrefined. With that settled, he decided they would continue practicing so that Haruto could eventually become a first-class swordsman. Nearby, Charlotte quietly peeked from behind as she watched them. Later that evening, Gordo sat at his desk and wrote something down. Charlotte had fallen asleep while resting on her mother's lap. Gordo placed his pen down and leaned back in his chair. His wife gently suggested that he should take a little rest. Gordo considered it and felt that resting for a while would be fine. His wife then served tea for both of them. As they sat there, she brought up the training earlier that day, mentioning that he had practiced sword arts with Haruto and wondering how it had gone. Gordo reflected on the experience and considered the possibility that Haruto might be something like a demonic being. The thought startled his wife, and she reacted with shock at what she had just heard. Gordo immediately gestured for her to lower her voice. He then explained that, according to confidential information from the royal family, there had been cases in the past where certain individuals had formed relationships with demons. Because of that, there were rare instances in which children were born with demonic features. His wife responded by pointing out that Haruto did not have horns or a tail. Gordo acknowledged that fact. However, he also noted that Haruto's royal crest had not yet become clear, and it might possibly possess some unusual power. In addition, Frey, who was an actual demon, showed strong admiration toward Haruto. Because of that, Gordo could not completely dismiss the idea that there might be some kind of secret between the two of them. Hearing this, his wife shook her head strongly, refusing to accept the idea. In her eyes, Haruto was nothing more than a normal child. Gordo's wife insisted that Haruto was not something like that. Gordo gently patted her head and reassured her not to worry, explaining that he shared the same belief. Because of that, he felt that even if something were to happen to them, they would still want their children to have their happiness. His wife agreed with that thought. Nearby, Charlotte heard the conversation. She quietly opened her eyes without the two of them noticing. In her mind, the thought was clear that her dear brother was certainly not a demon. Gordo's wife then observed that it seemed Gordo would remain busy even after this. Gordo confirmed that it was true. The number of victims caused by bandits had been increasing. His wife reminded him not to overwork himself. Charlotte closed her eyes again and drifted back to sleep, thinking about her dear brother. A few days later, Haruto lay on his bed. In his mind, it seemed that his father had been especially busy lately. At the same time, Haruto quietly acknowledged that the situation allowed him to take a break from their sword practice. Then he heard voices outside calling for bandages and disinfectant solution. Haruto wondered what had happened. The noise outside had grown unusually loud. He turned his attention to several floating screens and his eyes widened. Outside, numerous soldiers could be seen, many of them injured. One of the soldiers called out for everyone capable of using restoration magic to gather immediately. Others hurried to assist, prioritizing those who were seriously wounded. Haruto soon approached his father. Gordo looked exhausted and weighed down. Haruto sought to understand what had happened. Gordo revealed that he had not yet told Haruto about the situation, but recently the territory had suffered heavy damage due to bandits. After gathering information, they had located the bandits' base and moved to confront them. However, during the operation they were suddenly attacked from behind. They had already been cautious at the time, and their preparations had been thorough. Even so, the result had ended in what Gordo considered a shameful outcome. Haruto stood there quietly, his hands clenched into fists. His mother greeted Haruto with a morning greeting, and Haruto returned the greeting to her. She was Natalia Zemphis, the person who filled the role of his mother, In other words, the wife of Gordo. She was also someone whose age was closest to the one he had in his previous life. Natalia once again tried to hug him, but Haruto quickly avoided it. Situations like this had always been a bit troublesome for him. Natalia reacted with mild complaint, wondering why Haruto had dodged her. Haruto placed his hands between them to keep some distance. In his mind, the reason was simple. Natalia was a beautiful woman, and that fact made him feel somewhat awkward, especially considering his father. Natalia thought there was nothing wrong with it. In her eyes, he was still just a child. She also remembered how they had always been close when he was still a baby. Haruto recalled those earlier times. Back then, it had simply been something he had endured because he had no choice. He apologized to Natalia and explained that he had already graduated from that kind of thing. Natalia felt that it was still far too early for him to start separating himself from his parents. She saw Haruto as being stingy about it. Not giving up, she tried once again to hug him. Haruto managed to dodge her attempt once more. To be honest, he still did not quite understand how to properly get along with his mother. Meanwhile, outside the castle, many injured soldiers had gathered. Among them were also the fallen. Gordo stood there looking down toward the ground. At that moment, Haruto and Fry arrived before him. Gordo remarked that the scene might be too harsh for someone as young as Haruto. He suggested that Haruto should not force himself and should return instead. Haruto accepted the suggestion. Fry, however, reacted with disbelief. The idea that Gordo and the others had been defeated by mere bandits made her question what he had been doing. Haruto immediately called out to Fry and ordered her to stay quiet. The sudden command caught Fry off guard, leaving her unable to say anything further. Haruto then turned his back and began walking forward. Fry followed behind him as he moved through the middle of the injured soldiers. Floating cubes appeared around him and began tending to the wounded. Through Haruto's magic, their injuries started to heal. The soldiers looked confused as they realized their wounds had vanished. Some of them tested their legs and found that they could move again. Shock spread among them as they watched themselves being restored almost instantly. Soon that confusion turned into relief and joy as they understood what had happened. Nearby, Gordo could only stare in bewilderment, unable to understand what had just taken place. This scene was from the time when Fry and Haruto had just arrived at the residence of Margrave Gordo. That evening, Fry stood waiting outside Haruto's room. Inside, Haruto had just awakened on his bed. The rest had been good, which made sense to him considering how many injuries he had treated earlier. He got up and opened the door. Fry was standing there. Haruto looked at her and wondered what she was doing, realizing that she had apparently been there the entire time. In his mind, he questioned why she was not speaking. He called out to her again, yet she remained silent with her eyes closed. Then he remembered the earlier moment when he had told her to be quiet. The thought occurred to him that Fry might still be following that order from before. That would mean she had been standing there silently the entire time while he slept. The idea made him think she was truly a foolish girl. Haruto scratched his head and explained that he had only been upset earlier and that it was fine for her to speak now. Fry opened her eyes. She felt that she might have done something rude as well and sought forgiveness. Inside his mind, Haruto realized that she did not even understand the reason. Later, the two of them stood at the fortress while looking at several screens displaying scenes from different locations. Haruto focused on the images, determined that they needed to find the people responsible for attacking his father and the others. He examined the screens carefully. One displayed a forest, another showed the castle, and another showed a group of people gathered together. Something caught his attention. Among the men who looked like bandits, there also appeared to be a number of ordinary soldiers. Haruto realized that this was the place where his father and the others had been ambushed. The situation made him question what exactly was happening. Fry considered the possibility that those individuals might have been the ones providing information about them to the enemy. Haruto murmured the idea of spies to himself. He decided that he could not simply ignore the people who had caused trouble for his father. Allowing them to continue would eventually interfere with the quiet shut-in life he wanted as well. With that thought settled, Haruto decided that they would eliminate them completely. Fry accepted the decision without hesitation. They soon moved through the sky, flying toward their destination. Unnoticed by them, Charlotte stood by the window, quietly watching. That same night, the bandits were celebrating inside their hideout. The men gathered together while sharing drinks. One of them praised the lieutenant for the success of the day. The lieutenant reminded the man that in that place he should be addressed as the chief. The man laughed and commented that alcohol tasted even better while remembering how flustered the one known as the earth-ringing Warhammer had looked. The chief, however, did not see it as something worth boasting about. After all, Gordo had managed to escape. His intention was to finish the matter quickly and return to his own country as soon as possible. The others agreed with that thought. At that moment, Haruto's voice echoed through the place, as if he had just understood the situation. By the time the men reacted, several of them were already lying on the floor. Haruto and Fry had entered the area. The chief demanded to know who they were. Haruto raised his hand, and suddenly the men found that they could not move their bodies. Confusion spread among them as they questioned what had just been done to them. Haruto explained that he had only used a barrier to hold them in place. One of the men reacted with disbelief, unable to understand what he meant by barrier. Haruto felt annoyed by the noise and wished the man would simply be quiet. In the next moment he struck and cut off the man's head. The others froze in horror at what had happened. Haruto realized that he had been careless. He had unintentionally put too much power into the strike. Turning to the remaining men, he told them that everything would be fine as long as they answered his questions honestly. However, if they chose to lie, they should already understand the consequences. Two of the men immediately dropped to their knees. Haruto pieced together the situation in his mind. It seemed they were soldiers from the Empire, a neighboring kingdom. Their plan involved disguising themselves as bandits in order to invade the territory. Fry noted that there should have been guards stationed near the border. One of the bandits explained that they had a collaborator at the time, which allowed them to proceed. Haruto questioned them further about that collaborator, but they insisted that they knew nothing about it and swore that their knowledge ended there. Inside Haruto's thoughts, the idea seemed unlikely. Something like that would not have been possible without authority equal to at least his father's level. The thought then appeared that someone within the kingdom itself might be aiming for his father's life. The question of who it could possibly be remained unanswered. The chief stated that what they had shared was all the information they possessed, explaining that they had already withdrawn from the matter. Haruto accepted the explanation and expressed thanks for the information. After that, Haruto turned to Fry and asked her to burn everything there, including the entire fort, leaving no one behind. The chief tried to reason with them, insisting that they had only been following orders and that they would not do such a thing again. Haruto scratched his ear and showed that he did not care about their circumstances at all. In his view, they were the ones who had launched a surprise attack against his father. Because of that, he could not forgive people like them. Fry raised her hand and summoned flames that gathered in her palm. To her, this was simply punishment for those who had caused trouble for her master. The lesson was something they should remember well. The chief looked at them in confusion, unable to understand what kind of beings they were. Soon the two captured men were engulfed in flames, shouting desperately for help as the fire consumed them. Haruto and Fry turned away and walked off, leaving the fort behind as it burned. Afterward, Fry expressed her appreciation to Haruto for his effort. Haruto returned the thanks to her as well. In truth, he did not yet know whether the enemy behind this incident was a military officer from the Empire or someone from within their own kingdom who held a grudge against them. Even so, he had no reason to forgive someone who had interfered with his family's affairs. For the moment, he decided that they would send an anonymous letter to his father, informing him about everything that had happened that day. The following day, a messenger arrived with a report. The bandits' fort mentioned in the letter had been confirmed to be destroyed. Gordo listened carefully. The messenger explained that the entire place had been burned down, and there were many charred corpses at the scene. The investigation was still ongoing to determine whether the bodies truly belonged to the bandits. Gordo questioned what the Empire's guards had been doing during all of this. He then ordered the messenger to examine the origin of the letter once more. The messenger acknowledged the order and left. Gordo let out a sigh. He had already suspected that those enemies were not ordinary bandits, and it now seemed that the Empire had indeed been involved. In his mind, another thought lingered. The letter had warned that someone was after his life, which meant something troubling was unfolding behind the scenes. Charlotte, who was sitting in his arms, asked about the person who had defeated the bad men. Gordo considered the matter quietly. The methods used in the attack showed both skill and ruthlessness. Only one individual came to his mind who was capable of manipulating fire in such a way. That person possessed abilities even greater than Gordo's own, and at that very moment she was also responsible for controlling the demons within their territory. Because of that reasoning, Gordo could only conclude that the incident must have been Frey's doing. Charlotte quietly thought about the matter. In her memory, the image from that night returned clearly, the sight of Fry and Haruto flying through the sky together. After recalling it, Charlotte suddenly felt a sense of determination. She told her father that she had just remembered something she needed to do, and she quickly left the room. Gordo warned her that playing outside could be dangerous and told her to make sure to take someone with her. Charlotte acknowledged the reminder. After stepping out, she closed the door behind her and continued thinking to herself. The thought of her dear brother filled her mind as she wondered what he truly was. Fry stood before Haruto and asked what he thought about the outfit she was wearing. Haruto looked at her appearance and gave a simple response, thinking that it looked fine and suited her well. Hearing that made Fry pleased, as she was glad that Haruto approved of it. With that settled, Fry prepared to deal with the castle's problems immediately while wearing what she considered a fighting costume. Haruto wondered who exactly she was planning to fight. To Fry, the enemies were obvious. The stubborn dirt, the trash, and the dust hiding in every gap were all targets that needed to be destroyed. She began cleaning, but the broom she used snapped apart during the process. Fry threw it aside, dismissing it as a weak broom. Later, she moved to the serving area and began wiping the plates. One after another, the plates kept breaking in her hands. Each time it happened, she simply judged them as weak. At one point, the pot she was using even ended up catching fire. The maids nearby quickly offered to handle the cooking instead. However, Fry insisted that it was not necessary and declared that cooking was one of her specialties. The maids tried to explain that the issue was something else entirely. Meanwhile, baby Haruto remained in his room, quietly watching everything unfold through the screen. Charlotte approached Fry with something on her mind that she wanted to ask. The question that troubled her was why there seemed to be two versions of her dear brother. Fry glanced at her with confusion, wondering why Charlotte had suddenly said something like that and questioning whether her head was all right. Charlotte then explained what had happened. The previous night she had seen something that looked like the shadows of her dear brother and Fry flying through the sky in the middle of the night. To Charlotte, that did not make sense. In her understanding, her dear brother should not even have enough magic power to fly. Because of that doubt, she went to check his room. When she arrived, Haruto was there, sleeping peacefully. Her dear brother was definitely present in the room, but something felt different. She could not sense the usual frightening aura that she often felt from him. The entire situation left her wondering what was really happening. Fry reacted by recognizing that Charlotte was quite impressive for being able to sense Haruto's power at all. She explained that, to put it simply, Haruto was actually someone who possessed extremely strong magic power. That power had existed within him since the time he was still a baby. It had already reached a level far beyond what ordinary people could achieve. Even Fry herself, despite being a demon, could not reach that level. In simple terms, Haruto possessed remarkable power, something Charlotte should understand. Charlotte then realized that Fry had already known about her brother's true nature. Fry acknowledged that it was obvious. However, she could not reveal the details to Charlotte. She also warned that worrying too much about such complicated matters would only make things feel even more overwhelming. Charlotte accepted the explanation. Later on, Fry informed Haruto about the conversation and what had happened. Haruto understood the situation immediately. Charlotte had seen them flying the previous night, and she had even realized that the one she saw was his clone. In Haruto's mind, a troubling thought appeared. He wondered if his behavior had started to look suspicious. If he continued doing unusual things, it would only make that suspicion stronger. He began to imagine the possibility of Charlotte reporting everything to their father. Because of that, he started considering whether he should create a surveillance barrier as well. At the same time, he thought about setting an alarm somewhere unnoticed so he could keep track of what Charlotte was doing. While he was thinking about this, Fry asked how it was possible for there to be two Harutos. Haruto reassured her that she did not need to worry about that. Later, while Haruto was walking toward the toilet, Charlotte hid nearby. Haruto already knew she was there, yet being watched so closely still felt uncomfortable. Charlotte quietly followed behind him. In Haruto's mind, the idea appeared that he might try asking her directly why she had been monitoring him. He decided to attempt it. However, the moment he turned around, Charlotte quickly ran away. The attempt had failed. Charlotte glanced back while running, checking whether Haruto had followed her. Meanwhile, Haruto found it difficult to relax. On one of his screens, he could clearly see Charlotte's movements. Later, outside his bedroom, his mother informed him that it was time for his bath. Natalia arrived and handed him his towel. In Haruto's mind, he wondered whether Charlotte would really go so far as to follow him into the bathroom as well. He entered the bath and began to relax. Yet soon he sensed something again. Charlotte was nearby even there. The thought surprised him. She had been watching him for the entire day and still had not given up. The situation was becoming difficult for him to deal with. Even so, he smiled slightly, thinking that perhaps it would only last for that day. The next day, while he was practicing sword arts, he once again noticed Charlotte watching him. Gordo observed the situation and mentioned that Charlotte had been monitoring Haruto the entire previous day. It seemed to him that Charlotte might finally be taking an interest in her older brother. Inside Haruto's mind, however, the idea felt different. To him, it seemed more like mistrust rather than interest. Gordo then suggested that since they were siblings, Haruto might try becoming Charlotte's practice partner for a while. Haruto responded that he would think about it. Haruto reflected that the reality felt quite different. Charlotte constantly ran away whenever he tried to approach her. By the third day of the monitoring, Haruto could see Charlotte standing outside his room through his screen. By the fifth day, the sixth day, and even the seventh day, Charlotte continued watching him without stopping. Then one day at the breakfast table, Haruto learned that his mother and Charlotte were planning to go on a trip. Natalia explained that a festival was being held, and she wanted to show it to Charlotte since the girl had never left the area before. The trouble caused by the bandits had finally settled down. Because of that, Natalia believed it would be best to travel while things were still safe. Haruto had no desire to go anywhere. In his mind, it felt impossible for someone like him, a shut-in, to travel far from home. Instead, he suggested that Fry accompany them. Natalia explained that she had considered the same idea. However, she had not been able to find Fry in recent days. She wondered if Haruto had heard anything from her. Thinking about it, Haruto remembered that around 3 days earlier Fry had mentioned going out to negotiate with the demonic beings living nearby. Her goal had been to intimidate them and make sure they would not attack the nearby towns or villages. In that sense, Fry was surprisingly capable of handling such matters. Even so, there were still many areas that remained unsettled. For Haruto, the situation had one advantage. With Charlotte leaving on the trip, he would finally escape her constant surveillance after such a long time. That alone was good enough for him. Later, while Haruto was sleeping on his bed, something unexpected occurred. Suddenly, the warning mode connected to Charlotte's surveillance barrier activated. The change confused him. He wondered what had just happened. Haruto immediately checked the screens. The sight before him made his eyes widen in shock. The situation unfolding there looked almost unbelievable. Chaos had erupted. Soldiers were being stabbed. One of them urgently urged Natalia to run away as quickly as possible. Just moments later, another soldier swung his sword and killed him. Natalia quickly picked up Charlotte and ran while holding her tightly. Behind them, the soldiers shouted and ordered the others to chase them, making sure they did not escape. Natalia and Charlotte were now being pursued. During a certain lunch break, the maids had gathered together. One of them noticed something was bothering another maid and asked about it. The troubled maid explained that her boyfriend had promised they would get married once the battle ended, yet she had already been waiting for several years. Fry listened and quickly gave her opinion. In her view, a person who could not keep such a promise deserved to have his head cut off. The maid found the response convincing and began to think that it might indeed be better to cut ties with him. Another maid then shared her own concern, mentioning that her husband appeared to be cheating on her. A different maid spoke about how her mother-in-law constantly bullied her. Yet another maid sighed while complaining about the uncle living next door who snored loudly every night. Each time a problem was mentioned, Fry responded with the same simple conclusion, insisting that the solution was to cut it off. The other maids reacted with agreement, remarking that it truly required courage to cut ties with troublesome things. Before long, Fry had somehow taken on the role of a counselor for all of them. Natalia was running while carrying Charlotte as soldiers chased them from behind. In her mind, confusion filled her thoughts. She could not understand why soldiers from the Empire were present there. Their escort had already been completely defeated. Even so, she wished for only one thing, that somehow this child would survive. The pursuing soldiers began launching magic attacks toward Natalia. She glanced back and quickly used her own magic to block the incoming strikes. A loud explosion erupted behind her. The attacks continued as the soldiers relentlessly fired at both Natalia and Charlotte. Some of the strikes managed to slip past her barrier and cut into her skin. Natalia eventually lost her balance and fell, causing Charlotte to call out to her. Charlotte pointed toward the forest, indicating a direction. Natalia had not yet fully processed what was happening, but Charlotte urged her to move quickly. She directed Natalia to turn right and continue straight ahead. Inside Natalia's mind, a strange realization formed. It felt as though someone was giving Charlotte instructions. Yet she could not understand how such a thing was possible. Soon they reached the edge of a cliff. Below them stretched a steep drop. With determination in her eyes, Natalia leaped from the cliff. While falling, she used her magic to soften their landing as much as possible. They descended onto the cushion created by her magic. However, Natalia could feel her magic power rapidly running out. Continuing their escape like this would soon become impossible. Charlotte reassured her that they only needed to continue a little farther. She pointed toward a nearby cave and suggested that they could probably hide there. Natalia wondered again who exactly was guiding Charlotte. Regardless of the mystery, that unseen person had now become their only hope. When Natalia entered the cave, she was startled by what she saw. The inside of the cave was glowing. Natalia looked around the glowing cave and wondered how such a bright place could exist in an area like this. A location like that was not something that could normally be found. She gently set Charlotte down on the ground. After a moment of thought, Natalia decided that she would go and meet the person who had been giving Charlotte instructions. In her mind, that person was most likely trying to help them. Because of that, she asked Charlotte to stay there and wait. Charlotte did not want her mother to leave. Natalia responded with a reassuring smile, believing that everything would be fine and that she would protect Charlotte no matter what. She then released Charlotte's hand. Charlotte continued calling for her mother and begged her not to go, but Natalia had already stepped away. Natalia exited the cave and then turned back for a moment. Confusion appeared on her face as she touched a nearby boulder. The surface felt strange, and she realized that it was illusion magic. The thought crossed her mind about who could have placed such advanced magic in that location. At that moment, soldiers appeared and shouted that they had found her. They quickly surrounded Natalia. One of them remarked that only the mother was present and that the child should be somewhere nearby. The soldiers began searching for Charlotte. Natalia realized that she could not allow herself to be captured there. She pulled out a dagger. The soldiers watched in confusion, wondering what she was about to do. Natalia raised the dagger toward her own neck. In her mind, she asked for forgiveness from Gordo, from Charlotte, and from Haruto. However, before she could act, the dagger suddenly shattered into fragments. Shock filled her expression. In the next instant, something struck her from behind, and Natalia lost consciousness as she collapsed into Haruto's arms. Haruto looked at her and realized that he had not arrived in time, even though he had flown there at his maximum speed. The frustration within him grew stronger, and the anger began to rise. His voice burst out in anger. One of the soldiers asked who Haruto was supposed to be. Haruto reacted with fury and demanded silence. At the same moment, he released a powerful surge of magic. The force blasted the soldiers away, sending them flying backward until they crashed against the surrounding trees. Charlotte hid quietly inside the cave while covering her mouth with her hands. Tears filled her eyes as she thought about her mother. Soon Haruto entered the cave and informed her that Natalia was safe. Natalia had only lost consciousness for the moment, so Charlotte was told to stay beside her. Haruto explained that if Charlotte waited there for a little while, someone would eventually arrive to rescue the two of them. Because of that, she only needed to remain patient. Charlotte felt the presence surrounding him. The familiar and frightening aura reminded her of someone she had sensed before. Realizing that he had saved them, she turned around and loudly called out to her dear brother. Haruto instinctively waved in response. The moment he did so, Charlotte's eyes widened. In Haruto's mind, the realization came immediately that he had made a mistake. His reaction had been purely reflexive. Charlotte called out to him once again. Haruto swallowed nervously and responded while wondering what she needed. Charlotte then asked if he was a hero of justice. Haruto confirmed it. Inside his thoughts, he felt somewhat shaken. It was the first time he had properly spoken with his little sister, and her question left him confused. With no better answer in mind, he decided to simply follow along with the idea. Haruto smiled and affirmed that he was indeed the hero of justice. Charlotte reacted with excitement, believing that her assumption had been correct. In her understanding, her dear brother's power existed to defeat bad people. Haruto accepted that explanation. Charlotte also mentioned that Fry had once said her dear brother possessed incredible power. In Haruto's mind, a sudden concern appeared as he wondered whether Fry might have told Charlotte something strange. Charlotte admired the idea even more, realizing that she had misunderstood her brother all this time. Haruto then asked her to keep everything a secret, explaining that it would cause problems if others discovered the truth. Charlotte paused for a moment before agreeing. She even decided that she would lie to their father if necessary. For some reason, the thought made Haruto feel a slight ache in his chest. Even so, he pushed it aside. He then turned his attention to the next task, explaining that he needed to deal with the remaining enemies. Charlotte smiled and saw it as the work of the hero of justice. Haruto turned around and acknowledged the idea before leaving. Later, in the library, a messenger reported that Natalia and Charlotte were both safe. Fry had already joined them and was escorting them back home. The report also mentioned that many of the escorts had been killed or wounded during the attack. However, all of their injuries had been healed instantly once again. Gordo reflected on the situation and expressed the wish to show gratitude to the one responsible for saving them. At the same time, he believed that the person likely had no intention of revealing themselves to anyone. His eyes narrowed as he turned his attention toward Haruto and asked for his thoughts. Haruto was caught slightly off guard. After thinking for a moment, he reasoned that if this so-called hero of justice was not acting with hostility, then that person could not be considered a bad individual. Gordo considered the idea carefully. In the end, he agreed with Haruto's reasoning. Even Charlotte had referred to that mysterious person as a hero of justice, so for now it would be best to simply observe how things developed. Haruto agreed with that conclusion. He also thought that if soldiers from the Empire attempted to infiltrate again while disguising themselves as bandits, then the hero of justice would likely defeat them once more. Gordo's eyes widened at that remark. The question immediately arose about how Haruto knew that the attackers had been soldiers from the Empire. Haruto was momentarily caught off guard and realized he had spoken too much. He quickly explained that bandits usually targeted towns and villages. Because the attackers had instead targeted his mother and the others, he had assumed they must have been something else. Gordo listened carefully to the explanation. Haruto then pointed out that something about the situation still seemed strange. Even though the guards at the border had already been reinforced, the enemies had still managed to enter the territory. Gordo thought about the possibility and wondered if someone might have been hiding them before the border defenses were strengthened. Inside Haruto's mind, the thought appeared that the answer was close but still not quite correct. Gordo continued considering the situation and then raised another possibility. Perhaps someone had been supporting them and guiding their movements. Haruto immediately agreed with that idea. Gordo looked at him closely, which made Haruto pretend to cough lightly. Gordo then murmured to himself about a certain cunning woman, thinking that she had finally decided not to hold back. In Haruto's mind, the mention of a vixen created confusion. There had been no such information from the troops' reports, which meant the idea must have come from his father's own knowledge. Even so, Gordo acknowledged that Haruto had shown sharp thinking. At times, people around him found it difficult to believe that Haruto was truly only a 9-year-old boy. In Haruto's mind, the explanation felt simple. The body might belong to a child, but the mind inside still felt like that of an uncle. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed through the room as the door swung open. Charlotte had returned and happily greeted her father, announcing that she was home. Gordo felt a wave of relief upon seeing Natalia and Charlotte. He silently thanked the heavens that both of them had returned safely. Charlotte then noticed Haruto. Without hesitation, she rushed toward him and wrapped him in a hug. Haruto was caught by surprise. He tried to stop her, but Charlotte clung to him tightly, clearly having missed him very much. Natalia watched the scene with amusement and wondered when the two of them had grown so close. Gordo also looked puzzled and tried to understand what had happened. Charlotte insisted that nothing special had occurred. Haruto quietly muttered that the situation simply depended on the circumstances. In the end, he reminded himself that he was still considered a child, so something like this should be acceptable. At the same time, he realized he needed to be careful not to let his thoughts lead to any strange implications. After all, he did not want to trouble his parents. Charlotte expressed that she had come to truly like her dear brother now. She continued hugging Haruto while showing her affection. Inside Haruto's mind, he concluded that it was probably fine if she ended up liking him. The warmth of her cheek pressed against him was not unpleasant at all. In fact, it felt rather nice. Off to the side, Fry told the little girl to keep some distance from Haruto. Hearing that, Haruto felt oddly relieved. Natalia simply chuckled as she watched the scene unfold. Inside the castle, Charlotte's lively voice echoed through the hallway. She opened the door and eagerly asked her brother to play with her. Haruto reminded her that she should at least knock before entering. Charlotte quickly agreed and promised that she would definitely remember to do it next time. From that day onward, Charlotte began rushing into his room almost every day. In truth, she had done the same thing even back when she still disliked him. Haruto honestly could not tell whether he had missed that habit or not. Still, he realized that he did not dislike it. In fact, her presence seemed to have a calming effect on him. Her cuteness felt strangely healing, almost like a familiar development from a two-dimensional story, something he had always imagined and looked forward to. Later that day, Charlotte noticed one of the floating screens and became curious. She asked her brother what it was. Haruto explained that it was a type of surveillance magic. Charlotte reacted with amazement and wondered if it was ancient magic. Haruto confirmed that it was indeed something like that. Charlotte became even more impressed, convinced once again that her dear brother was an incredible person. The admiration struck Haruto with an unexpected feeling in his chest. At the same time, another thought surfaced in his mind. Earlier, he had told his father that he was researching ancient magic. Now he explained to Charlotte that since it was a form of lost magic, most of its sources had long since disappeared, which made studying it quite difficult. Charlotte suddenly mentioned that such information might still exist. She remembered seeing something related to it once in the castle's archives. Excited by the idea, she pushed Haruto forward and offered to guide him there. Haruto reacted with surprise at the possibility. The two of them soon began descending a staircase. Eventually they arrived before a massive door. When they stepped inside, the sight that greeted them was an enormous library. Haruto looked around in amazement, realizing that such a place existed within the castle. Meanwhile, Charlotte hurried around the room, grabbing books from different places. Before long she returned carrying a large stack. Haruto picked up one of the books and read its title, which discussed the possibility of reviving ancient magic. He flipped through the pages while examining the contents carefully. The material described the background of how individuals in the past had faced their own difficulties and eventually developed what became known as ancient magic. Ancient magic was described as a type of magic without attributes. The 4 elemental attributes that later appeared had shaped the system of magic that people now understood. As Haruto read, a realization began to form in his mind. Perhaps the barrier magic he had been using all along was connected to this ancient form of magic. Charlotte explained that there were many explanations about ancient magic, but the one written in that particular book was the most interesting. Haruto wondered whether she had actually read the book herself, especially since it contained many difficult words. Charlotte revealed that she had learned about it when her mother or Fry explained the contents to her. Because of that, she wanted her dear brother to read it as well. She smiled with firm determination. In Haruto's mind, it seemed there was no helping it. This was one of those moments where he would need to make use of his role as the older brother. Not long after, Charlotte ended up sitting on Haruto's lap while he held the book. Haruto felt somewhat uncomfortable and pointed out that there was a chair right beside them. Charlotte explained that both her mother and Fry had always read books to her like this. Hearing that, Haruto eventually gave in. Charlotte remained excited as he began reading. As Haruto continued through the book, a certain detail caught his attention. The story mentioned the existence of a god capable of traveling between different worlds. The development reminded him strongly of the kind of anime he used to watch. The thought of anime made him feel nostalgic. It had been a long time since he had seen anything like that. In fact, it was one of the few things he still found unsatisfying about living in this world. Charlotte grew curious and asked what kind of story anime told. Haruto thought about it and considered that explaining it properly might take quite a long time. He even wondered if Charlotte would truly understand the concept. Charlotte insisted that she would listen seriously. Haruto confirmed the idea and decided to go ahead with the explanation. He continued talking at length about it, describing the concept in detail. In the end, he summarized it by explaining that the pictures in anime moved and could also speak. Charlotte's eyes sparkled with interest. At that moment, Haruto realized he might have become too enthusiastic without noticing. Normally this would be the kind of situation where Charlotte might withdraw. He tried to call her attention carefully. Charlotte became quiet for a moment. Then she suddenly asked about the idea of pictures that could move. To her, that sounded like a very strange kind of magic, and she wanted to see it as well. Haruto felt surprised by the reaction. He realized that Charlotte truly wanted to see it. In truth, he wanted to see it again himself. Charlotte laughed softly and mentioned that she felt happy whenever her dear brother enjoyed what he was doing. Haruto blushed slightly. In his mind, he silently thanked his mother for raising Charlotte to be such a kind girl. With renewed motivation, Haruto decided that he would do his best so that they could someday watch anime together. From that moment onward, a new plan quietly began to form in his mind, finding a way to connect this world with modern Japan so that anime could be watched there. After many attempts filled with trial and error, 2 weeks eventually passed before the plan finally succeeded. The exact details of the process could hardly be explained, but in the end Haruto managed to gain access to works from modern Japan. Even his personal account on a video distribution site still remained active. The situation puzzled him for a moment. Yet considering that a god existed who could travel between different worlds, the possibility no longer seemed completely impossible. With that thought, he decided it was acceptable enough. Even so, there was one precaution he could not ignore. He adjusted the account settings to children's mode so that Charlotte would not accidentally watch anime meant for adults. Charlotte stood nearby, filled with excitement. She looked at the device with curiosity, realizing that it was a magical tool capable of showing anime. Haruto told her to choose whichever one she wanted from the many options available. Charlotte reacted with amazement at the large number of choices. After scanning through them, she pointed toward one particular anime. The moment it began playing on the screen, she stared with fascination. She pointed at the moving image, surprised that the cute girl inside the screen could move as well. Haruto noticed her sharp observation and decided that they would watch that one. The animated girl on the screen shouted out a dramatic move. Charlotte watched in complete amazement. The picture was not only moving, but it could speak as well. This, in her mind, was anime. The experience felt wonderful. Charlotte expressed how impressed she felt with her dear brother at that moment. Haruto felt satisfied hearing that. However, Charlotte soon noticed a problem. Although she could see the characters and hear them speak, she could not understand what the girl in the anime was saying. Haruto had already anticipated that issue. The reason was simple. The language being spoken was Japanese. Charlotte then asked him to teach it to her. In Haruto's mind, he knew that learning a language was usually difficult. However, Charlotte was still only 5 years old, which meant she might absorb it quickly. Even so, he had no idea how long it would take. Soon the alphabet appeared on the screen as part of the explanation. Charlotte observed that the meanings of the letters were displayed clearly, and she found the structure of the writing system interesting. Haruto soon found himself surprised. In only 2 hours, Charlotte had already mastered both hiragana and katakana. Now he watched as Charlotte began using the search bar, typing the word justice and looking up its meaning. Haruto stared in disbelief. Not only had she already learned the basic syllabaries, but she had also begun picking up simple kanji. She was even able to use the search website without difficulty. The thought crossed Haruto's mind about how unbelievable this was. He could only wonder what exactly was going on with the children in this world. Charlotte rushed into his room with excitement, asking her dear brother for the next episode of Tamizan. Haruto looked at her and wondered if she had really come to like that anime so much. Charlotte explained the reason for her enthusiasm. In the story, a huge city called Saitama had been overrun by zombies, and the heroes of justice who protected everyone filled her with excitement. Haruto remembered that she once said she did not know anything about things like trains or cars. Charlotte explained that such concerns were no longer a problem for her. 2 weeks had already passed since Charlotte began watching anime. During that time, she had also been learning Japanese. By now, she had almost completely mastered it. Haruto could not help but wonder if Charlotte might actually be a genius. If that were the case, he began to feel that perhaps letting her watch anime constantly might not be the best idea. At the same time, he himself had continued watching anime even as an adult. Still, Charlotte was clearly enjoying it very much. The situation left Haruto unsure of what to do. Yet as her older brother, he felt he needed to think about it carefully. Later, an anime hero on the screen struck a dramatic pose. Charlotte reacted happily, thinking that the episode they had just watched was interesting as well. She was about to select the next anime when Haruto stopped her. Charlotte looked at him with confusion. Haruto then explained that watching 5 episodes in a row was not good. He held up his fingers and told her that she could only use the television for 3 hours each day. Charlotte reacted with shock and wondered why. Haruto reasoned that too much of it would not be good for a child's body. Charlotte insisted that she was still perfectly healthy. Even so, Haruto did not change his mind. The answer remained no. After that, he reminded her that it was time to go, as dinner was about to begin. Charlotte looked visibly depressed. In Haruto's mind, however, the decision still felt necessary, as it was meant for her own good. Charlotte walked away with a defeated posture. When she later sat down at the dinner table, her mother noticed her condition and wondered if she might simply be sleepy. Gordo then turned his attention to Haruto. Recently, Haruto seemed to be spending a great deal of time with Charlotte, which made him curious about what the two of them had been doing together. Charlotte explained that they had been researching lost magic. After saying that, she quietly murmured something under her breath. Natalia reacted with amusement, thinking that Charlotte had become Haruto's assistant. She reminded them to be careful not to become too absorbed in their research. Haruto acknowledged the advice. Later on, Charlotte quietly followed behind Haruto. When he noticed her presence, he turned and reminded her that even if she continued following him, she still would not be allowed to watch anime. Charlotte responded with teary eyes, showing that she already understood. In Haruto's mind, it seemed that she was truly holding back her feelings. He told her that she should go take a bath and then go to sleep for the day. Charlotte agreed. Haruto then decided that he should also head to the bath. Later, he stepped into the water and began to relax. To his surprise, Charlotte soon sat down beside him in the bath. Haruto reacted with confusion and wondered what she was doing there. Charlotte simply reminded him that he had told her to go take a bath. In Haruto's mind, he realized that he had indeed said that. Charlotte explained that if she could not watch anime, then there was nothing left for her to do except sleep. Haruto could not help but think that she had just spoken her very first line that sounded like something an otaku might say. He quickly clarified that this was not what he had meant and questioned why she had decided to bathe with him. Charlotte explained that their mother had told her that she should go to the bath together with her dear brother for that day. Haruto quietly understood the reason. In his mind, he reasoned that both of them were still children, so there was technically nothing wrong with it. Even so, a strange feeling of unease lingered within him. Charlotte then stared at him closely. Haruto felt troubled by her gaze and wondered why she was looking at him so intently. Soon he realized that her attention was fixed on the royal crest on his body. Charlotte seemed to recognize it. Haruto reflected that Charlotte still did not know much about it. Over time, it had also become something he rarely thought about anymore. Charlotte mentioned that she felt as though she had seen the crest somewhere before. To her understanding, it was a symbol that proved he was a hero of justice. Hearing that, Haruto simply laughed. Haruto admitted that Charlotte's guess was close enough. In his mind, he realized that she had simply connected it with anime. He then reminded her that it was supposed to remain a secret. After all, he needed to keep his identity as the hero of justice hidden. Charlotte accepted that without hesitation. After that, the two of them stepped into the bathtub together. Later, once the bath was finished, Charlotte came to Haruto to wish him good night. Haruto returned the greeting before the two of them went their separate ways for the night. Haruto lay down on his bed and eventually closed his eyes. Sometime later, he noticed something unusual. Charlotte had somehow fallen asleep beside him. The question immediately appeared in his mind about why she was there. At the same time, another thought surfaced regarding what their mother might be doing. Near the doorway, Natalia was quietly peeking inside the room. She seemed pleased, thinking that she had not expected the two of them to become so close. A quiet chuckle escaped her as she imagined that her long-held wish might finally come true. She even raised her thumb in encouragement, silently cheering Charlotte on. Haruto noticed everything. He almost spoke up to protest, but in the end he simply closed his eyes again. For the moment, he could only hope that they would allow him to sleep peacefully. Outside the castle, rows of soldiers stood lined up and ready. Gordo addressed them, preparing to depart and subjugate the bandits. Natalia wished him well and asked him to take care. As Gordo began walking away, Charlotte stood nearby and waved her hand, hoping that her father would return safely. Later on, Charlotte sat quietly with a gloomy expression. Haruto noticed her mood and tried to reassure her. In his mind, the bandits they were dealing with this time were mostly former commoners. Because of that, he believed that their father would likely be fine even if he faced them alone. Charlotte remained silent for a moment before expressing a different thought. She wondered why those people had become bandits in the first place. Haruto recalled what his father had mentioned earlier. There had been a power struggle happening within the kingdom. On top of that, many commoners had been forced to live in harsh conditions. The number of people who could no longer endure such lives had been increasing, and many of them had eventually drifted into this territory. Charlotte reflected on that explanation and concluded that those people must have been individuals who could not live happily. Haruto gently shook his head. In his view, no one truly wished to live like that. Even so, the situation itself was very complicated. Charlotte then turned the question toward him, wondering if the same kind of situation might one day involve her dear brother as well. Haruto seemed puzzled at first, unsure what she meant. Charlotte clarified the thought and asked whether her dear brother would also go there. Haruto hesitated and admitted that he could not really say for certain. Charlotte then explained her belief that the power her dear brother possessed existed for that very reason. Inside Haruto's mind, the thought appeared that her words sounded like a line taken straight from some anime. He tried to remember which series it might have come from. Charlotte looked at him with shining eyes and pleaded with him. Haruto hesitated for a moment before eventually agreeing. Charlotte immediately expressed how much she loved her dear brother. Then she encouraged him to transform and go out there. Haruto paused in confusion, trying to understand what she meant. In his thoughts, he realized that this must be related to another anime idea. Charlotte had recently been watching a futuristic science fiction battle anime, if he remembered correctly. Accepting that logic, Haruto called out for a transformation. His appearance changed into that of a heroic figure, wearing a black suit and a flowing cape. Charlotte watched with amazement. To her, it looked as if her dear brother had transformed into an adult. The sight felt incredibly cool. Meanwhile, deep inside, Haruto felt a sense of embarrassment. Charlotte, however, became even more excited and expressed her wish to join him as well. Haruto explained that it would be dangerous, so Charlotte could not come with him. Charlotte's expression immediately fell again. Seeing her disappointment, Haruto handed her a screen. With that device, she would be able to watch his heroic actions from afar. Charlotte accepted it and thanked him. After that, Haruto stepped out the door and made his departure. Later, deep in the forest, Haruto stood on top of a tree while several screens floated before him. He let out a quiet sigh. The entire situation felt unnecessarily troublesome. Even so, since this was for Charlotte's sake, he accepted that it could not be helped. Soon he located the group he was searching for. The first step was to block their escape route. Haruto created a barrier in advance. As the men were walking and talking, they suddenly collided with the invisible wall. With that barrier in place, Haruto could simply leave them there until his father arrived. However, he remembered that Charlotte was watching through the screen. She would probably want to see some action. With that thought, Haruto decided to move. He approached the group, and the men immediately demanded to know who he was. Haruto struck a dramatic pose and declared himself as the hero of justice. In his mind, the message was simple. If these criminals did not surrender peacefully, they would experience pain. The men reacted with confusion, wondering what kind of strange person had appeared before them. Soon they stopped treating the situation lightly and called out to the others to attack. Haruto prepared himself. He kicked one of them aside, struck another with a punch, and slapped the remaining ones. In only a short moment, the men collapsed onto the ground. Inside Haruto's mind, he realized that he had accidentally defeated them all at once. Since a young child was watching the scene through the screen, he had made sure to avoid causing any blood to splash. After all, that kind of sight would be troubling. Just then, a voice suddenly called out from behind him. Haruto turned around and saw that his father and the soldiers had arrived. The timing immediately struck him as unfortunate. Gordo looked at the scene and considered what had happened. Haruto did not appear to have been separated from any allies, which made it seem as though he had defeated all the men by himself. In Haruto's mind, the question quickly arose about what he should do next. There was no easy way to explain the situation. Gordo then introduced himself and asked for the mysterious figure's name. At that moment, Haruto had an idea. If he was going to handle this situation, then he needed to remain fully in character. Yes, character. With that thought, he realized he might actually be able to push through the situation by continuing to act as the hero of justice. Haruto struck another dramatic pose and placed a hand on his head. In that moment he attempted to introduce himself, but the truth was that he could not think of a proper name at all. As a result, his name remained undecided. Gordo observed him carefully and considered the possibility that this mysterious figure might have been the same person who had saved his wife and daughter earlier. Haruto reacted as if the idea were unfamiliar to him. Gordo then wondered what purpose this man had for appearing there. Inside Haruto's mind, he knew he could not reveal the real reason. Admitting that everything had begun for Charlotte's sake would be impossible. After a brief pause, he gave a single answer. Justice. In his mind, the explanation took shape. He was someone who enforced justice, spoke of justice, and carried out justice. At the same time, deep within himself, Haruto felt an overwhelming sense of embarrassment. The entire performance was so awkward that he wished it would end immediately. Without lingering any longer, he leaped high into the air and disappeared from the scene. Gordo watched him leave and quietly wondered what kind of man he had just encountered. Later that night, Haruto lay on his bed, slumped in exhaustion. He could hardly believe that he had actually done all of those things. Charlotte, however, reacted with great excitement. In her eyes, her dear brother had looked incredibly cool. Haruto questioned whether it was really that impressive. Still, seeing Charlotte happy about it made the effort feel worthwhile. Even so, the experience had left him with an intense amount of mental exhaustion. Charlotte then wondered when he would go out again. The question caused Haruto's expression to turn pale. The idea that he might have to repeat the performance again caught him completely off guard. Charlotte, on the other hand, could hardly wait for the next time. From that point onward, Haruto found himself going out again and again to act in the same role. Before long, the mysterious figure began to earn a name among people. They started calling him the Black Warrior. And with that, Charlotte's image of her heroic figure, shaped by her imagination and youthful enthusiasm, had finally been born. Haruto, who possessed no magic attribute and could only use barrier magic, continued living quietly as a shut-in while experimenting with practical magic every day. Through repeated trials, he eventually arrived at a certain conclusion. To him, the true meaning of a barrier was the creation of a personal world. For example, he could control the temperature of a room simply by adjusting the barrier around it. By setting the environment within the barrier, he was able to maintain the temperature at exactly 25 degrees. He also experimented with strengthening his body. By placing a barrier around himself and imagining greater strength, his defensive power increased. On the surface, the results seemed simple enough, yet the emotional or more complex aspects of this ability were still under investigation. Since barriers could also be given color, Haruto discovered that he could place one over his chest to conceal the royal crest when necessary. In other words, the visible form of the barrier could be shaped entirely according to his imagination. He then experimented with another variation, which he referred to as the plate barrier. Haruto created two flat barriers, sending one of them flying to a distant location. Through it, he could observe the scenery that lay ahead. It was the same technique he had used earlier when his mother and Charlotte had been attacked. At present, Haruto had placed these barriers throughout the territory. The total number had already reached 1,000. Even with that many active barriers, he felt no noticeable drain on his magic power, which remained a complete mystery. Haruto also made it a habit to set alarm barriers around people close to him. Because the barriers were transparent and invisible, they remained extremely convenient. While thinking about future possibilities, another idea appeared in his mind. If possible, it would be impressive if he could eventually achieve teleportation. Soon another thought surfaced. Haruto wondered whether it might be possible to move through the plate barriers themselves. As he imagined such a concept, the idea of a strange space forming between the barriers came to mind. After considering it for a moment, Haruto decided that he had thought enough for one day. With that conclusion, he stopped his experiments and ended the session for the time being. Haruto suddenly burst into laughter. At last, the moment he had been waiting for had arrived. Standing before him was his clone. The figure introduced itself and stated that it was Haruto Zemphis, now 10 years old that year. Haruto observed it carefully and asked how it felt. The clone replied that everything was fine and that there were no problems. It even let out a yawn. Haruto then tested it further by asking about the weather that day. The clone answered calmly and pointed toward the window, indicating that the weather could easily be seen by simply looking outside. The sky was clear. Haruto continued with another question, wondering if the clone felt hungry. The clone responded that such a function had not been included. However, if it received an order to eat, it would do so. Haruto scratched his ear as he listened. For the past several months, he had spent much of his time studying books from the castle's archives. Using only the limited information he had gathered there, he had worked on creating a copying robot. Now, after all that effort, he had finally managed to produce a perfect copy of himself. The clone soon remarked that it would go to sleep if there was nothing else to do. Haruto watched it and felt a strange mix of emotions. The resemblance was almost too accurate, which somehow irritated him, yet at the same time the result was remarkable. With this achievement, Haruto realized that he could finally live the quiet shut-in life he had always wanted. The clone lay down and fell asleep. While the clone rested, another movement caught Haruto's attention. Charlotte slowly sat up from Haruto's bed, still half asleep. Both Haruto and his clone were startled to see that Charlotte had been there the entire time. Charlotte looked dazed as she observed the two identical figures before her. To her eyes, both of her dear brothers appeared to be talking. The situation left her wondering which one belonged to her. Both Harutos immediately rejected the idea. Charlotte then reacted with excitement. To her, the important part was that the other brother had finally started speaking. In her mind, it meant that her dear brother's magic had succeeded. Just then, a voice from outside called for Haruto and Charlotte to get ready. Haruto wondered what could possibly be happening that day. Charlotte explained that earlier that morning their father had mentioned they would be receiving guests from the royal capital. Haruto reacted with mild surprise, not remembering hearing anything about such a visit. In his mind, the idea of meeting strangers felt troublesome. Then an idea occurred to him. Haruto turned toward his clone and explained that the situation was sudden, but the clone would need to attend in his place. However, before he could finish explaining the plan, the clone immediately refused the task. Haruto could only think that both the clone and himself were equally useless in that moment. Later, outside the castle, the family stood waiting for the guests to arrive. Soon the visitors appeared. The young boy who had come with the group complained about the dusty surroundings and wondered if this place was what people referred to as the countryside. The girl accompanying him responded that such remarks were rude. After all, he had been the one who insisted on visiting the place in the first place. Gordo stepped forward and greeted the visitors properly, expressing gratitude for their long journey. He addressed the girl as Princess Marianne and the boy as Prince Reyes. Afterward, Gordo gestured toward his own family. Inside Haruto's mind, a surprising thought formed. He knew that these two were members of the royal family, but the idea crossed his mind that they might actually be his biological siblings. Prince Reyes reacted strongly to something Gordo had said, focusing on the phrase that had included the word also. He reminded everyone that he was the prince, the one destined to rule over them. Gordo sighed quietly and apologized for the careless remark. Reyes responded with an attitude that suggested Gordo should naturally understand his position. Princess Marianne quickly scolded him, telling him to stop behaving that way. In her view, being royalty meant they had an even greater responsibility to act with courtesy. Reyes immediately turned his irritation toward Marianne and complained that she should stop acting like his older sister. He insisted that he was an important figure and not a political tool like her. Marianne faltered for a moment at the comment. The people around them watched the exchange. In Haruto's mind, the situation felt almost unbelievable. The prince's behavior resembled the kind of exaggerated character often seen in stories. Haruto wondered who could have possibly raised such a foolish child. At that moment, Reyes noticed Haruto looking in his direction. Reyes called attention to him, accusing Haruto of staring. He seemed to believe he had already understood the situation. Reyes looked at Haruto and remarked that he was the adopted child of the Margrave, the one rumored to have come from an orphanage. In his eyes, Haruto was nothing more than a level 2 nobody. Reyes seemed displeased and commented that people in this place did not even understand basic manners. With that in mind, he decided that the first thing he would do was properly teach Haruto how to behave. To accomplish that, he proposed a duel. Gordo attempted to interrupt, sensing that the situation might become problematic. However, before he could finish speaking, Reyes continued confidently, declaring that he would go easy on Haruto. The duel would be fought with swords. Haruto let out a quiet sigh. In his mind, the entire situation felt unnecessarily troublesome. There was no reason for him to get involved in something like this. Reyes repeated his assurance that Haruto should not worry, since he would not be too harsh. In response, a thought occurred to Haruto. If Reyes was truly that confident, then it might be interesting to see his actual ability. Haruto activated a special technique. The magic measurement began. This was a barrier-based spell he had created himself and placed over his eye. Through it, he could measure the magic level of the person standing before him. The result appeared. Reyes's level was shown as 9 out of 40. Haruto then considered the numbers more carefully. Charlotte had once mentioned that the great sage, said to be the most powerful individual in the world, possessed a level of 77. If that was the case, then someone who had already reached nearly half of their maximum level at such an age could certainly be considered talented. Reyes stood at 9 out of 40. Haruto then glanced toward his father. Gordo's level appeared as 32 out of 32. The results surprised Haruto. That number was incredibly high, and it seemed almost normal for someone like Gordo. Yet when Haruto looked at himself, the result remained the same as always. 2 out of 2. The comparison left him with a strange feeling. Somehow, it seemed that he alone had ended up in such an unusual position. Reyes suddenly demanded to know what Haruto had been staring at. Without waiting any longer, he swung his sword toward Haruto. Haruto moved quickly and avoided the strike. Reyes became irritated and insisted that Haruto should not dodge. In his view, it would be impossible to properly discipline Haruto if the attacks kept missing. In Haruto's mind, the response seemed simple. If Reyes wanted things that way, then he would just follow along. At the same time, Haruto had no intention of getting hurt without doing anything, so he prepared a small adjustment. He quietly reinforced his body with magic. After that, Reyes struck him repeatedly from both sides. Eventually, Reyes stepped onto Haruto's back and pressed him down. Haruto showed a sign of surrender. Reyes questioned why Haruto was not attempting to fight back at all. Haruto considered the question and wondered if it was finally acceptable to respond. If Reyes was expecting resistance, then he might as well grant that request. Reyes jumped back down to the ground, but the moment he looked again, Haruto had already moved behind him. Haruto struck him on the head. Reyes collapsed onto the ground. The sudden outcome shocked everyone watching. Gordo and Natalia both reacted with surprise. Reyes himself looked stunned as well. He quickly stood up and attacked again. This time, however, he began to notice something strange. Haruto's movements had completely changed. Reyes could not understand what had happened. Before long, Reyes was once again on the ground. Even then, he still tried to lash out weakly while struggling. Reyes felt humiliated by the situation, unable to believe he had been pushed into such a state. Haruto watched him and wondered if Reyes was finally giving up. Nearby, Charlotte stared in disbelief. The idea that Haruto was truly level 2 no longer made sense to her. Movements like those should have been impossible unless a powerful self-reinforcement spell had been used. Gordo admitted that he did not know the answer either. Even the person involved had claimed not to understand it. Because of that, Gordo had simply accepted that Haruto was naturally like this. Charlotte questioned whether it was really acceptable to leave the matter unexplained. Meanwhile, Reyes suddenly charged forward again. Haruto reacted with surprise as he saw power gathering in Reyes's hands. Marianne immediately tried to stop him. However, Reyes released a fireball toward Haruto. Haruto responded by activating his magic, and the flames vanished before reaching him. Reyes looked at his own hands, where fire had gathered once more, and cursed in frustration. Even so, the attack had already been neutralized. Marianne stepped forward again and insisted that Reyes had already gone far enough. Reyes demanded to know how much longer he was expected to endure such humiliation. He pointed out what he had witnessed, realizing that his magic had been absorbed by something. Haruto calmly explained that it had simply been his own magic. Since the situation had suddenly become dangerous, he had decided to stop the attack before it went any further. Reyes reacted with disbelief. To him, it was impossible that someone with a level as low as 2 could perform something resembling high-tier magic. Haruto tried to explain that even though he had asked Fry about it before, there were still certain things he could do in his own way. Reyes dismissed the explanation entirely. To him, no one would ever believe such a simple claim. At that moment, Haruto remembered something. He formed a massive fireball in his hand and wondered whether he should return it to Reyes. After recalling the name of the spell, he confirmed to himself that it had indeed been a fireball. The sight horrified Reyes. Overwhelmed, Reyes dropped to his knees and slumped forward. Haruto, however, thought that the gesture had only been meant as a joke. With the tension finally gone, he let out a small chuckle. The entire ordeal had finally ended. All he wanted now was to return to his room and rest. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed someone standing nearby. It was Marianne. She bowed politely, offering an apology for her younger brother's rude behavior toward Haruto. Haruto felt that such an apology was unnecessary. In his mind, it was not something an older sister needed to take responsibility for. Marianne then asked another question. She wondered if Haruto was truly level 2. Haruto confirmed that it was true. With that settled, he prepared to take his leave. At that moment, another thought crossed his mind. If news of his level 2 status had already reached the royal capital, it might mean that someone there had been searching for him. The possibility briefly made him wonder if his real parents might be involved. However, he quickly dismissed the idea. After all, those were the same people who had easily abandoned him in the first place. The thought that they would be searching for him now felt impossible. Rewinding time to 9 years earlier, shortly after Haruto had been taken in by Margrave Gordo, the situation had been far less comfortable. At that time, Haruto had been crying loudly from hunger. He had repeatedly asked Fry for breast milk, yet the foolish girl kept responding with stubborn remarks that made no sense to him. As the moments passed, Haruto felt his consciousness gradually fading. Inside his mind, a desperate thought appeared. He did not want to die like that. In the end, he realized that he would have to take a certain approach. He began crying even louder. Gordo soon noticed the problem and realized that he had forgotten about the milk. Fry once again mentioned the idea of breastfeeding, but Gordo quickly stopped her, pointing out that such nonsense would only make things worse and the baby might die if they delayed any longer. Once Haruto finally drank the milk, the baby's eyes sparkled with renewed life. However, on that day, while he had succeeded in obtaining milk to survive, Haruto also felt that he had lost something important as a person. In the present, Reyes slammed his fist against the table in frustration. Anger filled his thoughts as he tried to understand why the situation had turned out this way. He was the prince, a descendant of the Lightning Princess and the one expected to rule next. In his mind, defeating someone like Haruto should have been easy. After all, Haruto was supposed to be nothing more than a level 2 nobody. A voice from outside requested permission to enter. An attendant soon stepped in and informed him that the dinner party would begin shortly, so he needed to prepare himself. Reyes clenched his teeth. The attendant also mentioned another matter. For the inspection scheduled the following day, Charlotte was expected to be invited as well. Reyes reacted with irritation, wondering why he should invite someone like that. The attendant calmly explained that having a companion to talk with during the inspection would be beneficial. Reyes insisted that it was unnecessary. However, the attendant reminded him that the arrangement had been made with his own interests in mind, so he needed to accept it. Reyes remained silent for a moment. Although he was clearly displeased, he eventually agreed. Meanwhile, back at the castle, Charlotte burst into Haruto's room together with his clone. Haruto had been asleep, but Charlotte excitedly announced that the party had already finished. She also apologized for forgetting to knock before entering. Haruto responded with a smile. He began talking about the dinner, remembering how much food had been served. The dishes that evening had truly been extravagant. Behind him stood the clone, watching as Haruto happily praised the meal. The clone stared at him and complained about the situation. Haruto had forced him to attend the party in his place, and the experience had clearly taken its toll. The clone remarked that Haruto should understand the difficulty, since the clone was essentially the same person as him. Haruto answered with cheerful honesty, admitting that he would not have been able to endure it himself. The duplicate let out a long sigh and collapsed onto the bed. In his frustration, the clone muttered about how he was always being made to do things he did not want to do. The thought left him questioning how others truly saw him. Charlotte looked toward the bed and noticed the second brother lying there. Curious, she wondered whether the other dear brother was all right. Charlotte mentioned that she would also be joining the inspection scheduled for the next day. Haruto heard this and reacted with surprise, wondering why Charlotte would be involved as well. Charlotte explained that the prince himself had invited her earlier. In Haruto's mind, an odd suspicion appeared, wondering whether the prince might have questionable intentions. Haruto and his clone exchanged glances. After a moment of thought, Haruto accepted that the situation could not be avoided. If Charlotte was going to attend, then he would go as well. In fact, he felt it would be safer to prepare properly since she would be there. Because of that, he decided to investigate the inspection route beforehand. While observing the surroundings, something unusual caught his attention. A group of people wearing cloaks had gathered together. At the center of their formation, some kind of magic circle had been prepared. Haruto quietly wondered what those people were doing. The scene clearly suggested that something suspicious was about to happen. In any case, he decided to check it out. Haruto moved closer to the group while wearing a cloak of his own. After approaching them, he removed the cloak and revealed the outfit of the Black Warrior. He then demanded to know what they were doing there. The cloaked men reacted with surprise and quickly questioned who had appeared before them. Haruto responded casually, presenting himself as nothing more than a passerby. However, he also mentioned that the matter would soon be reported to Margrave Gordo Zemphis. The men immediately became alarmed. One of them angrily concluded that Haruto must be acting as the Margrave's pawn. At once, he ordered the others to eliminate him and ensure that he did not escape. Haruto accepted the situation without hesitation. If that was their decision, then he would not hold back either. Before long, most of the cloaked men had already been defeated. However, one of them managed to hide behind a tree. The man refused to accept dying in such a place. In desperation, he rushed toward the magic circle and shouted as he activated it. In response, skeletal knights began to rise from the center of the circle. There were many of them. Haruto watched as the skeleton soldiers appeared. It was the first time he had ever seen such creatures in reality. They had always looked impressive in games, but encountering them in person felt somewhat unsettling. The surviving cloaked man quickly commanded the skeletons to attack Haruto. Haruto drew his sword and immediately began fighting against the skeletal knights. With a single slash of his sword, Haruto cut down the skeleton soldiers, sending them collapsing onto the ground. However, moments later the bones began to move again, and the skeletons slowly stood back up. Haruto observed the scene and realized that the result was exactly what he had expected. The cloaked man shouted once more, ordering the skeleton knights to surround Haruto and restrict his movements. In response, the skeletons rushed toward him from every direction, leaping forward and gathering around him. Haruto reacted quickly. A cube-shaped barrier appeared around him, and the moment the skeletons closed in, a powerful force burst outward. The skeleton knights were blown away in all directions, scattering across the ground. Yet even after being shattered apart, they began to rise again. Inside Haruto's mind, the realization came that the skeletons would continue like this endlessly. While watching carefully, he noticed something unusual. On the chest of each skeleton, there was a small red object. At that moment, Haruto understood what it was. Meanwhile, the cloaked man grew confused. He demanded to know why the skeletons had stopped moving and ordered them to attack again. However, the skeletons remained motionless. The cloaked man wondered what had gone wrong. Suddenly, the skeleton knights slowly turned their heads toward him instead. In the next instant, they charged at their own summoner. The man panicked, unable to understand why the creatures were no longer obeying him. Frustration and fear filled his thoughts as he cursed the situation. Realizing that the skeletons were no longer under his control, he decided to summon something else. With another activation of the magic circle, a large golem emerged from the center. The massive creature raised its fist and struck the ground with tremendous force, smashing the area where the skeleton knights stood. Deep inside, Haruto felt a strange excitement rising. Seeing a real golem before his eyes thrilled him, and a faint blush even appeared on his face. The skeleton soldiers were completely crushed beneath the golem's strike. The display of strength was impressive. Soon the golem turned its attention toward Haruto. Haruto immediately sensed the danger. Realizing the situation was not good, he quickly formed a barrier to protect himself. For a brief moment he felt relieved. However, the golem's massive fist struck with tremendous force. Even through the barrier, the impact sent Haruto flying backward. His body shot through the air until his back slammed against a tree. A strained sound escaped him as he absorbed the blow. The moment stirred a distant memory. Back when Haruto had still been a baby, Natalia had decided that she would personally care for the child of royalty. Looking at the infant, she had felt sympathy for him, seeing him as a pitiful child. She had been about to reach out and touch him when Frye suddenly reacted with intensity, warning her not to come any closer to Haruto. Natalia had then asked Gordo about Frye's identity. Gordo explained that her name was Frye and that she belonged to the demon kin. It also appeared that she had formed a master-servant contract with the child. Natalia then wondered whether Frye had already given milk to the baby. Frye replied that she had indeed fed him earlier. Natalia realized that the feeding Frye referred to had taken place around lunchtime. However, by then it was already evening, which meant the baby should have been fed again long ago. Even as Natalia tried to approach, Frye continued blocking her from getting close to the baby. Natalia patiently explained that a baby needed milk roughly every 3 hours. She also reminded Frye that the child should not be handled roughly. After the long journey they had just taken, the baby needed proper rest. Natalia reassured Frye that she had no intention of taking the child away from her. Instead, she suggested that they both do their best together to care for him. Frye still appeared uneasy for a moment. However, after calming down, she eventually handed the baby over. Natalia gently held Haruto in her arms. With warmth and sincerity, she expressed that she would always be there for him. In Haruto's mind, the thought appeared that such a caring stepmother felt almost wasted on someone like him. From that moment onward, Haruto found himself welcomed into a loving family. The cloaked man shouted in triumph, convinced that Haruto had finally been caught. Confident in his advantage, he ordered the golem to continue striking Haruto without hesitation. Haruto, however, had already steadied himself against the tree where he had landed. In his mind, he admitted that he had underestimated the golem's defensive power. The sturdiness of the creature had truly surprised him. As expected from something like a golem, its durability was remarkable. Even so, the attack had not caused him any real damage since he had been acting passively until that moment. Now the question was how to subjugate such a creature. As he watched the golem carefully, Haruto noticed something unusual. Embedded in the center of the golem's chest was a distinct object. At that moment the golem raised its massive fist again and smashed it into the ground. There was still some distance between them, so Haruto decided to close the gap slightly. He leaped forward toward the golem. With precise timing, he pulled out a sharp object and hurled it directly toward the center of the golem's chest where the embedded stone was located. The projectile pierced straight into it. The golem's eyes suddenly flashed. Despite the damage, the golem continued advancing toward Haruto and prepared to strike him with another punch. However, the movement halted halfway. The cloaked man grew confused. The golem had suddenly stopped moving. He quickly ordered the creature to attack again, demanding that it obey his command. Instead, the golem slowly turned its head toward him. Without warning, it swung its enormous fist toward the cloaked man. The summoner was shocked by the sudden betrayal. He could not understand why the creature had turned against them or what had gone wrong. Haruto raised his hand slightly, admitting that the result was likely his own doing. The cloaked man stared in confusion. Haruto explained that he had been searching for a way to stop both the golem and the skeleton knights. In the process, he had pierced the golem with a stake-shaped barrier. However, because of the nature of his ability, the barrier had been converted and had taken control instead. The cloaked man reacted with disbelief. The idea of hijacking a summoned creature through a skill was something he considered impossible. Haruto simply remarked that the result had already happened, so there was little else to say. The remaining cloaked men began to grow uneasy. Haruto then asked who their leader was. No one answered. Seeing their silence, Haruto decided on another approach. Instead of waiting for a response, he would question them individually. With a command, the skeleton soldiers moved forward and began capturing every one of the cloaked men. The skeleton knights quickly bound the cloaked men with ropes. After securing them, Haruto asked them to reveal their names and affiliations. He also wanted to know why they had gathered in that place. None of the men answered. Haruto began to wonder if perhaps he had been too polite. Speaking with people had never been his strength, and the silence made the situation awkward for him. The thought left him feeling troubled. Since there was no response, he decided there was only one option left. Haruto snapped his fingers. At once, the skeleton knights produced shovels. They began digging into the ground, quickly creating a deep pit. Once it was ready, the skeletons lifted the cloaked men and tossed them inside. The skeletons then started pushing soil back into the hole. The cloaked men began shouting desperately for help. Haruto calmly explained that they had two choices. They could be buried just like that, or they could tell him the truth. The decision was theirs to make. One of the men clenched his teeth in frustration as the skeletons continued shoveling dirt into the pit. The cloaked men shouted louder as the soil gradually covered them. In their panic, they began calling for their captain. The captain had been holding out until then. However, the pressure finally broke his resistance. He confessed that they were part of a summoner unit acting under the direct orders of the queen. Their mission was to prepare summon creatures that would attack during the inspection scheduled for the next day. That was why they had been conducting their preparations in that location. Haruto reacted with confusion when he heard the word queen. The idea that the queen herself was involved raised a serious question. He grabbed the captain by the collar and demanded to know the true objective behind the plan. The captain finally revealed it. Their target was Charlotte Zemphis. Haruto was stunned. He could not understand why the queen would aim for Charlotte. The captain explained that Charlotte possessed qualities that would eventually surpass those of the queen. Because of that, the queen feared that the kingdom might split in two if Charlotte gained the backing of the Margrave. For a long time, they had relied on cooperation from the Empire to carry out such operations. However, after 2 failed attempts, the Empire had refused to continue assisting them. As a result, the queen had issued the order personally and sent this summoner unit to carry out the mission. As the captain finished speaking, a realization slowly formed in Haruto's mind. He paused and considered the events that had happened before. The Empire soldiers who had attacked his father, the ones who had targeted his mother and Charlotte, and now this assassination plot. The thought connected all of them together. It seemed that everything had been arranged by the same woman. Haruto held his head as the understanding settled in. The pattern now appeared clear to him. Even the moment long ago when he had been abandoned might have been connected to that same person. The woman behind it all was someone who would do anything to protect her own position. The thought filled him with anger. At that moment, almost as if responding to Haruto's feelings, the golem suddenly grabbed the captain. The creature tore nearby trees from the ground and hurled the heavy logs into the pit. The wooden trunks crashed down onto the cloaked men. The captain shouted in panic as the golem's arms swung again. Suddenly Haruto realized what was happening. He quickly recognized that things were going too far. A quiet sigh escaped him as he regained control. There was one thing he knew clearly. Anyone who tried to take away the people important to him would never be forgiven. Even if the person behind it happened to be his real parent. With that thought lingering, Haruto began considering what he should do next. The memory of an earlier time came back to him. When Haruto had still been a baby, Natalia had been caring for him closely. As she looked after the child, a faint blush appeared on Haruto's face. Fry noticed Natalia's expression and asked what was troubling her. Natalia had been puzzled. 3 days had already passed, yet the baby's diaper had remained clean the entire time. Haruto had been drinking plenty of milk and showed no signs of illness, which made the situation even more confusing. Natalia could not understand what was happening. In Haruto's own mind, however, the answer had been simple. His condition had been perfectly healthy. The reason the diaper stayed clean was because he had been quietly using the toilet by himself. Each time, he would inform Fry that he needed to go. Fry would check whether anyone else was nearby. Once the area was clear, Haruto would handle the matter on his own and then inform her afterward, even thanking her for the help. Fry later explained to Natalia that there was nothing to worry about. She had simply been interested in taking care of Haruto's hygiene herself. Inside his mind, Haruto could only protest at the way it was described. Natalia listened to the explanation and realized that the task had been entrusted to Fry. She accepted it, though she remarked that it was somewhat unfortunate. As a result, Natalia decided that she would instead take responsibility for Haruto's bathing and feeding. Fry agreed to leave those tasks to Natalia. Meanwhile, inside his thoughts, Haruto could only wish that he would grow into an adult much faster. The sound of a carriage moving along the road echoed through the surroundings. Fry sat calmly on top of the carriage, while inside sat Marianne, Reyes, Charlotte, and Haruto. Reyes remained quiet with an irritated expression. A sigh escaped him as the carriage continued its journey. Charlotte noticed his mood and spoke up, explaining that he did not need to feel discouraged after losing to her dear brother. In her view, the result had been obvious from the beginning. Reyes visibly grew more irritated. Charlotte continued her reasoning, adding that Reyes should actually feel proud for having challenged Haruto in the first place. That remark only made Reyes angrier. Marianne then joined in, supporting Charlotte's point. She believed that losing a match was not something shameful. Reyes's face turned red with frustration. Haruto eventually stepped in and asked both girls to stop. Reyes snapped immediately. The last person he wanted to hear such words from was Haruto. Marianne tried to shift the conversation, remarking that this trip gave them a good opportunity to speak with Haruto about many things. Reyes's irritation deepened. He pointed out that during their earlier fight, Haruto had not seemed to use any magic at all. The question of what he had actually used continued to bother him. Haruto responded by explaining that he had used magic after all. His method simply involved strengthening himself by reciting something simple, like telling himself to become stronger. Marianne and Reyes stared at him in shock, unable to understand what kind of explanation that was supposed to be. In Haruto's mind, the reaction seemed strange. When he had given a similar explanation before, his father and the others had accepted it without question. Reyes thought carefully about the matter before arriving at a conclusion. To him, Haruto might be something known as a cursed child. Marianne immediately scolded him for saying such a thing. Reyes defended his idea, wondering how anyone could avoid that conclusion given Haruto's unusual circumstances. Haruto then turned to Charlotte and asked about the meaning of a cursed child. Charlotte explained that it referred to rare cases where a demon and a human formed a union, and their descendants inherited unusual traits. Haruto quietly acknowledged the explanation. As expected, Charlotte seemed to know almost everything. Marianne added further clarification. Such individuals were often said to possess athletic ability and magical power far beyond ordinary people. However, in Haruto's case, he had no horns, and his eyes and ears showed no obvious differences either. Charlotte confidently explained that her dear brother's body was smooth and clean as well. Marianne reacted with surprise at the remark. Charlotte then proudly added that everyone could trust her statement, since she and her dear brother often bathed together. Both Marianne and Reyes immediately blushed, visibly shocked by what they had just heard. Reyes turned toward Haruto and demanded confirmation, clearly startled by the idea that they had been bathing together. Marianne also reacted strongly, believing such behavior to be improper. Inside his mind, Haruto quietly protested that the situation had never been his idea in the first place. Charlotte, however, seemed confused by their reactions and wondered whether there was anything wrong with it. Reyes hesitated before responding. In his view, he could not say it was entirely wrong, yet it was certainly not something people usually did. Marianne quickly pulled Charlotte closer and began explaining the matter seriously. She described that when a man and a woman exposed their skin together, it held a special meaning connected to the continuation of their family line. As she continued speaking, her explanation drifted into more detailed and awkward territory. Haruto immediately grew alarmed and tried to stop the conversation before it went any further. At that moment, the carriage came to a halt, signaling that they had arrived. Everyone stepped out. Charlotte's excitement quickly returned as she looked around. They had reached a farm. She gazed across the open fields with wonder, amazed by the vast stretches of grass covering the land. Marianne looked over the wide field and acknowledged that it was indeed a beautiful wheat field. For Haruto, it was the first time he had ever seen one like this. In Japan, most of the fields were rice paddies instead. The thought of rice came to his mind, and he realized that he had not eaten it for a long time. Charlotte, filled with excitement, invited Marianne to look further ahead with her. Marianne quickly reminded her to be careful, since running around like that could be dangerous. Nearby, Reyes glanced at Haruto with a sharp look. However, the moment he turned his head back, he noticed Fry standing behind Haruto, quietly growling at him. The sight made Reyes turn away again. At that moment, a memory surfaced from earlier. Charlotte had once asked Fry whether she was able to fly through the sky. Fry had explained that it was not that she could not fly. The real issue was simply that she had not fully gotten used to it yet. Charlotte immediately became interested and expressed her wish to fly as well. With sparkling eyes, she asked Fry to teach her. Fry eventually agreed, though only once. She took a stance and told Charlotte to watch carefully. Charlotte watched with great excitement. Fry then leaped upward and rushed forward with great force, soaring briefly before tumbling down into the nearby forest. After landing, Fry explained that this was what happened when she gave it her all. Charlotte was amazed by the display and seemed deeply impressed. Fry smiled proudly at the reaction. Meanwhile, Haruto had been observing the scene through one of his screens. Watching the entire event, he quietly noted that Fry had not actually managed to fly at all. Soldiers moved across the field as part of the inspection, while Charlotte and the others watched from a distance. From afar, Gordo observed the royal siblings together with his daughter. Haruto soon approached him and asked if he could spare a moment. Gordo turned his attention to Haruto and wondered what had brought him there. Haruto explained that something had been troubling him. He sat down beside his father. Gordo noted that it was unusual for Haruto to come looking for him like this. The situation made him assume that the matter must be important. Haruto admitted that it was. However, he described it only as a hypothetical question. He wondered what Gordo would do if the queen were targeting Charlotte's life. Gordo's eyes widened at the suggestion. Haruto quickly became uneasy and apologized, explaining that he might have asked something strange all of a sudden. Gordo reassured him and explained that the concern itself was not strange. It seemed that Haruto had sensed something unusual as well. The previous night, Gordo had received another letter from the mysterious Black Knight. According to the message, the Black Knight had defeated several wizards who had been trained under the Queen's authority. Gordo had already suspected that the Queen harbored hostility toward him. However, realizing that Charlotte might also be her target made the situation far more serious. To Gordo, it appeared certain that the Queen intended to eliminate their family. Even so, the Queen was still their ruler. No matter how much he might wish otherwise, there was little he could do about it. Haruto fell silent for a moment as he considered those words. Afterward, he remarked that it might be better if the Queen simply disappeared. The remark was made seriously enough that Gordo stared at him in surprise. Gordo then gently patted Haruto's head and told him not to say such reckless things. In truth, the situation would become even more problematic if the Queen were gone at this time. Haruto asked why that would be the case. Gordo explained that although the kingdom appeared stable on the surface, the king, Zerk, had already lost much of his authority. Many aristocrats were quietly aiming for the throne. Because of that, the Queen's presence served as a stabilizing force that kept those ambitions in check. If the Queen were to die, it would likely trigger a major conflict within the kingdom. This part of the story went back to a time 2 years before Haruto was born. During that period, a special unit was formed to subjugate the Demon King. The king himself led the campaign, and among the members of that unit was a woman named Gizelot. In the end, the one who defeated and beheaded the Demon King was none other than Gizelot herself. Because of that achievement, she was celebrated across the kingdom as a hero. The citizens praised her and began calling her the Lightning Princess. Her popularity continued to grow. With strong support from the public, she later married the king, which only strengthened her influence and reputation. Now, in the present, that same Lightning Princess was gradually trying to bring the kingdom under her own control. Haruto listened to the story and reflected on it. The woman clearly possessed an extraordinary record of achievements. At the same time, he realized that it had been a mistake not to investigate those people more thoroughly before. His usual desire to stay uninvolved had made him overlook too much. Gordo then added that the situation might have been different if someone powerful enough to replace the queen had appeared. That remark made Haruto think of something. He wondered why his own father had not become the king instead. Gordo simply smiled at the thought and explained that he lacked the talent for politics. Because of that, he did not consider himself suitable for such a role. Even so, Gordo hinted that the future might hold other possibilities. Haruto did not immediately understand what his father meant. Gordo continued by explaining that such a possibility existed, though it was still too early to act on it. For now, he preferred to wait until the right age arrived. Haruto paused for a moment before a realization came to him. The answer was Charlotte. Gordo acknowledged the idea. He believed that the seemingly carefree child would one day grow into someone remarkable, capable of leading the kingdom. In Haruto's mind, the thought made sense. Charlotte truly was an intelligent girl. Gordo went on to say that Charlotte possessed immeasurable talent. In fact, he believed that her potential might even surpass that of the Lightning Princess. However, Charlotte herself did not yet seem aware of that power. Even Haruto, who often considered himself slow to understand things, could clearly grasp the meaning behind those words. Gordo then gently patted Haruto on the back and asked whether he would support that future. Haruto answered without hesitation. After that, he stood up. Inside his mind, the goal became clear. His task was to protect Charlotte until the day she grew into a worthy queen. If that future came true, he would finally be able to relax and enjoy living quietly as a shut-in in this world. Later, Haruto walked across the field together with Fry. During their walk, Fry asked for permission to present Haruto with the queen's head after personally beheading her. Fry believed that she would be the one to avenge Haruto for what had happened in his previous life. Haruto remembered that Fry still held the misunderstanding that he had once been a demon king in that past life. He explained that the matter between him and the queen was something personal. There was no meaning in it unless he dealt with it himself. Fry responded with a satisfied smile. To her, that attitude was exactly what she expected from Haruto. If that was the case, She would simply take the role of witnessing the moment when it happened. The two of them continued walking together. While moving across the field, Haruto reflected on the situation. The woman who ruled the kingdom would certainly become a problem in the future. Because of that, protecting Charlotte alone would not be enough. From a distance, Charlotte noticed him and waved her hand. Haruto returned the gesture. A thought then crossed his mind. Perhaps it was time for a reunion between mother and child after 10 long years. The memory of an earlier moment surfaced. At that time, Natalia had approached Charlotte and Fry, asking what the two of them had been doing. Fry explained the situation, which left Natalia surprised. The topic involved the idea of flight magic. Natalia told Charlotte that it was still too early for her to attempt such a thing and warned her not to try something impossible. Charlotte became visibly discouraged. Fry noticed the change in Charlotte's mood. Unable to ignore it, she asked them to wait and then rushed away. Meanwhile, Haruto had been sitting at his desk when Fry suddenly burst into the room. She hurried in so quickly that she stumbled and called out to him. Haruto immediately understood the situation without needing further explanation. He handed Fry a certain item and told her to go. Some time later, a small flying craft appeared above the area, carrying Charlotte in the air. Charlotte looked around with amazement as she experienced flying for the first time. Natalia watched in surprise and wondered what exactly she was seeing. Fry calmly reassured her that Charlotte's safety was completely guaranteed. Elsewhere, Haruto observed the entire scene through one of his screens. As he watched Charlotte flying happily in the sky, a quiet smile appeared on his face. In his mind, the mission had been successfully completed. While watching several floating screens, Charlotte suddenly called out to Haruto and informed him that she had discovered some suspicious people. Haruto slowly stood up and moved toward the screen, his eyes still closed as he approached. Recently, Charlotte had become accustomed to monitoring the patrol screens, and because of that development, Haruto had ended up becoming quite busy. At that moment, the door burst open with a loud bang. Fry rushed into the room after hearing from the young lady that Haruto had carried out an attack on his own. Because of that report, she had hurried over immediately. She insisted that Haruto should allow her to take part in the responsibility as well. Inside his mind, Haruto could only react with frustration, realizing that the troublesome situation had arrived. He asked Fry whether she was not already busy with many other tasks. Fry responded that there was no problem. Recently she had already finished all the matters involving the monsters that controlled the garden. Hearing that, Haruto realized that Fry had come fully prepared. Charlotte, observing the conversation, reached a conclusion. To her, it seemed that Fry would also be joining the attack. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. Both Haruto and Fry paused at that remark. Charlotte continued her reasoning enthusiastically. In the story she knew, whenever a hero faced a difficult situation, there was always a partner who supported him. In her mind, that role clearly belonged to Fry. Haruto silently resolved that he would eventually forbid this child from watching anime. Fry responded confidently, acknowledging the idea. Although she believed she was still far from reaching her master's level, she still considered it natural that her presence would become a source of strength. Haruto immediately warned Fry in his thoughts not to get carried away. Fry and Charlotte both turned toward him with eager expressions. Haruto reacted with visible annoyance and remarked that the situation had become troublesome. Eventually, he called Fry to come with him. They moved into the hallway, where Haruto stopped and spoke seriously to her. He explained that it was not good to express such extreme ideas in front of Charlotte and wanted to make sure she understood. Fry confirmed that she understood. Haruto repeated the point once more to make it absolutely clear. Fry calmly acknowledged it again, confirming that she understood. Later that night, several men gathered near the forest. Around them were bags and boxes filled with gold. The group looked pleased with their success. From their reactions, it was clear that this time they had managed to obtain a large haul. With so much gold in their possession, they no longer needed to worry about starving for a while. At that moment, a figure appeared before them. The one who arrived was the Black Warrior. He stepped forward and demanded to know what they were doing in that place. One of the men stared at him in confusion, trying to understand who or what he was supposed to be. Haruto declared his presence dramatically as the Black Warrior. The men began whispering among themselves. They had heard rumors about the Black Warrior before, but none of them knew who the person behind the title actually was. Suddenly, another figure appeared. Fry arrived wearing a black suit of her own. She introduced herself under the name Flame Fenrir, also calling herself the Red Warrior. With confident enthusiasm, she declared that she would burn all of them into charcoal. Haruto was immediately surprised by the declaration. He quickly tried to stop her, wondering whether she even remembered the conversation they had earlier. However, before he could finish intervening, Fry had already launched flames toward the group of men. Haruto shouted for her to stop, noticing that the fire was spreading. The flames rushed toward the men, but Haruto quickly created a barrier to shield them from the burning attack. Fry observed the result and realized that the attack had been ineffective. Without hesitation, she decided to escalate the situation. Larger flames gathered in her hands, and she swung them widely toward the men. The group nervously scrambled to dodge the spreading fire. Fry watched the chaos with shining eyes and clear excitement. Haruto raised his voice again and demanded that she stop. He reminded her of their earlier discussion about avoiding extreme behavior. Fry acknowledged the reminder, but she still insisted on her reasoning. In her view, anyone who caused trouble for her master was automatically an enemy. Inside his mind, Haruto realized that she had completely missed the point. At that moment, Fry herself had become the nuisance. Ignoring his concern, Fry burst into loud laughter and once again hurled flames toward the frightened men. Haruto muttered in frustration, feeling that the situation had become completely ridiculous. He repeatedly told Fry that it was enough and urged her to stop. He instructed her to leave the final strike to him and return home first. Fry accepted the instruction and expressed her understanding, believing it to be exactly what she expected from her master. She then moved to conclude the situation. Inside his mind, Haruto only wished that she would simply go home already. After everything settled down, the men eventually left the area in exhaustion. Haruto himself was no different. By the time he returned, he collapsed face-first onto his bed, completely drained. Charlotte reacted with excitement. In her eyes, her older brother and Fry had both looked incredibly impressive. To her, the entire scene had even resembled a comedic performance like a manzai routine. Fry, however, reflected on the fight with a different opinion. She believed she should have attacked with her full strength. Something had interfered with her power during the battle, preventing her from assisting Haruto properly. Haruto silently wished that she would stop talking about using her full strength. Fry then declared that next time she would certainly give it her all. Haruto could only think that there absolutely should not be a next time for Fry. Charlotte, on the other hand, cheerfully remarked that she was looking forward to watching another performance like that in the future. Haruto was taken aback by the realization that this had been what she had been waiting for. Looking at Charlotte's happy expression, he found himself thinking that if it made her smile, perhaps another outing with Fry might happen again someday. Even so, the thought returned to him once more. He wondered when the day would finally come when he could peacefully live the quiet life of a shut-in.